The courtroom buzzed with an oppressive energy, the air so thick with tension it felt like it might choke anyone who dared to breathe too deeply. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed incessantly. Their icy, unforgiving glare spilling across the room, illuminating the glossy wooden floors and the tightly packed rows of benches. The crowd murmured restlessly, their hushed voices weaving a web of anticipation and unease. Eyes darted between faces, some wide with curiosity, others narrowed in judgment. This wasn't just another trial, it was something far heavier, something that reached beyond the dry pages of legal code. It was a collision of power and defiance, a raw, unspoken battle over who held the reins and who was forced to kneel. And there, at the heart of it all, stood a woman, tall, unyielding. Her dark skin catching the sterile light in a way that seemed to defy its coldness. She was a black woman, her composure a quiet fortress. Her dignity an unshakable force that radiated through the room. Across from her loomed a man who couldn't have been more her opposite, a police officer, his broad chest puffed out. Arms folded smugly over his uniform, the badge pinned to it glinting like a taunt under the harsh glow. The officer's smirk was a permanent fixture, etched into his face as though carved there by years of unchallenged authority. He'd stood in this courtroom countless times before, each visit reinforcing his belief that he was beyond reproach. To him, the law wasn't a boundary, it was his weapon, his sanctuary, a sandbox where he could shape the rules to fit his whims. And this woman? She was nothing in his eyes, just another black face. Another insignificant speck daring to step out of the shadow he'd cast over her kind. He didn't see a person, he saw a challenge to the order he'd spent his life enforcing. An order where he reigned supreme and she belonged beneath his boot. With a sneer twisting his lips, he edged closer to her, his voice thick with disdain as it sliced through the air. You people always think you're clever, don't you? Always trying to outsmart the system, like it's some game you can win. His words dripped with arrogance. His pale eyes raking over her with a mix of mockery and contempt. So damn defiant, acting like you're somebody when you're not. The insult landed hard, a verbal lash meant to sting. But she didn't so much as blink. Her face remained a mask of calm, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. That stillness, it infuriated him. Inside, his blood churned, a slow boil rising in his chest. He wanted her to break, to flinch, to give him the reaction he craved so he could revel in her defeat. He wanted to see that spark in her eyes flicker out, crushed beneath the weight of his authority. But she gave him nothing, her quiet strength louder than any shout. His smirk twitched, morphing into something uglier, something feral. What, too good to talk back now, he spat. Stepping even closer, his bulk towering over her, his uniform a silent threat. Think you're special? Let me show you what respect looks like. And then, in a flash of calculated cruelty, he lashed out. His boot slammed into her with a sickening thud, a brutal, deliberate strike meant not just to hurt but to humiliate. The courtroom erupted in gasps. The sound of his attack echoing off the walls like a gunshot. Shock rippled through the crowd, a wave of horror and disbelief that seemed to thicken the already stifling air. The judge's gavel crashed down, a sharp crack demanding order, but the chaos only grew, voices rising, murmurs swelling into a low roar. Yet amid the tumult, she didn't crumble. She stumbled, yes. Her body jolting from the force, but then she caught herself. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened, her spine a steel rod. Her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made the hairs on his neck prickle. There was something in her eyes, something fierce, unreadable, alive, that unnerved him in a way he couldn't name. His bravado faltered, just for a heartbeat, but he masked it with a laugh, loud and hollow. Adjusting his belt with a casual swagger, he shook his head as if he'd merely brushed off a pesky insect. That's the trouble with your kind, he drawled, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. Always thinking you can stand toe-to-toe with real power. The air in the room grew heavier still. Charged with outrage that simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. This wasn't just an act of violence, it was a declaration, a stark reminder of how power could be twisted into a bludgeon. How prejudice was stitched into the very seams of the system. The officer thrived on it, drunk on the belief that he was untouchable, that men like him could always walk away unscathed. But then, the courtroom doors burst open with a force that jolted every head in the room. The sound of heavy boots reverberated through the stillness, a steady, purposeful march that cut through the tension like a knife. A line of uniformed officers filed in, their movements crisp and deliberate, led by a man whose presence demanded attention. His face was a blank slate, betraying nothing, but the air around him crackled with authority. The smirking officer's confidence wavered, just a flicker. A tiny crack in his armor as doubt crept into his gut. "Officer, stand down," the commanding figure barked, his voice a blade slicing through the haze. The officer scoffed, tossing a lazy glance over his shoulder. "Relax, I was just," but the tone that cut him off was iron, leaving no room for defiance. Something shifted in that moment, a subtle but seismic change. The room's energy turned, a tide pulling away from him, the control he'd clung to slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. And then he saw it, a faint, fleeting curve of her lips. A smirk so subtle it might have been a trick of the light. But it wasn't. It was knowing, deliberate, almost amused. His stomach twisted. Something was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. The commanding officer exhaled, a sharp, measured breath, tilting his head slightly toward her. Then came the words that shattered the officer's world, "Meet your new boss." They hit him like a thunderclap, his body going rigid, his throat closing as his pulse hammered in his ears. No. That couldn't be right. His mind reeled, clawing for a lifeline. Some explanation to unravel the nightmare unfolding before him. Panic, raw, ugly, and unfamiliar, burned in his chest. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. His bravado stripped away in an instant. He turned to her, eyes wild, searching for a sign this was a cruel jest. But when their gazes locked, he saw it again, that fire, that unbreakable resolve. And now, the power she wielded. The ground beneath him seemed to buckle, his once solid foundation crumbling to dust. The whispers in the courtroom swelled. A chorus of stunned murmurs and sharp glances. Some smirked, savoring the twist, others glared, their anger now laced with triumph. This wasn't just justice, it was retribution. A cosmic reckoning for every abuse of power he'd ever inflicted. He knew it in his bones, whatever came next would dwarf any punishment he'd ever doled out. The hunter had become the prey. The weapon he'd once wielded now turned against him with merciless precision. And the question gnawed at him, what happens when the system he'd trusted to shield him decided instead to hold him up as a warning? In that moment, the lesson was clear: power, when abused, plants the seeds of its own destruction. Justice, patient and unyielding, waits to reap the harvest. Outside, the city throbbed with its relentless pulse, sirens wailing in the distance. Voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony, horns blaring as the sun dipped low, bathing the skyline in a warm, golden hue. This was a place where power wasn't just an idea, it was a currency. Traded in the shadows of towering buildings and upheld by legacies etched into the concrete. For Officer Richard Mitchell, this had always been his domain. A veteran cop with a chiseled jaw, close-cropped blonde hair, and piercing blue eyes, he carried himself like a king, his uniform a second skin he wore with pride. He'd climbed the ranks not just by enforcing the law but by bending it. Aligning himself with the right allies, silencing anyone foolish enough to cross him. To Mitchell, the world was simple: some were born to rule, others to obey, and he was the arbiter of that divide. Fear had never touched him, until now. Days earlier, before the courtroom unraveling, Mitchell had been in his element, cruising the city streets in his patrol car. The hum of the engine was a lullaby, the flickering lights of the dashboard a crown he wore with smug satisfaction. These streets were his kingdom. The people scurrying along the sidewalks mere subjects who knew better than to meet his gaze. He'd built his life on this certainty, this unshakable belief in his own invincibility. But as the tires rolled over the asphalt, a shadow loomed on the horizon, one he hadn't seen coming, one that would teach him that even the mightiest thrones can topple when justice demands its due. The sun hung low over the city, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement as Officer Richard Mitchell gripped the steering wheel of the patrol car with a quiet intensity. His knuckles whitened slightly, not from fear but from the sheer force of habit, a habit born from years of bending the world to his will. He'd spent decades carving out a reputation. One forged not in the pristine pages of official reports but in the unspoken corners of the streets he ruled. Fear followed him like a loyal dog. A shadow he'd nurtured through methods no one dared question aloud. Rules existed, of course, guidelines about force, rights, and justice, but to Mitchell, they were flimsy things. Paper shields that crumpled under the weight of the one enforcing them. And he was that enforcer, a man who'd learned long ago that power wasn't given, it was taken. Beside him, Officer Tim Reynolds slouched in the passenger seat, his youthful face bathed in the soft glow of his phone screen. Tim was green, barely a few years into the job. His cheeks still carrying the faint flush of innocence that most cops shed like old skin. He flicked his thumb across the screen, oblivious to the tension radiating from the man next to him. Mitchell didn't mind the kid, liked him, even. Tim didn't poke his nose where it didn't belong, didn't challenge the way things were done. He followed orders with a quiet diligence, and better yet, he looked at Mitchell with something bordering on reverence. That kind of loyalty was rare, a currency Mitchell valued more than any commendation pinned to his chest. "Court's gonna be a damn circus today," Tim muttered, his voice tinged with irritation as he kept his eyes on the phone. He didn't look up. Didn't see the faint smirk tug at the corner of Mitchell's mouth. Mitchell tapped the steering wheel idly, the red light ahead bathing the car in a crimson haze. "When isn't it?" he replied. His tone dry as gravel. "Just another punk with a sob story, thinking they can cry their way out of what's coming. Same old game." Tim hesitated, his thumb pausing mid-scroll. A faint frown creased his brow, and he shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under him. "I heard this one's different," he said, quieter now, as if testing the waters. "Big case. Civil rights people are all over it. Media too. Sounds like a mess." Mitchell's scoff cut through the air like a blade. He rolled his eyes, the gesture heavy with disdain. "Oh, please. Another wrongfully arrested fairy tale? Spare me, Reynolds. How many times do I have to tell you? You give these clowns an inch, they'll take everything you've got. That's how it works." The younger officer squirmed, his discomfort palpable. Doubt flickered in his eyes, unspoken, unformed, but they're all the same. Mitchell felt it, a subtle shift in the air between them. But he brushed it aside. Tim would figure it out eventually. They all did. Justice wasn't some shining ideal, it was a myth, a pretty word people threw around to feel better about the chaos. Control. Though, that was real. And Mitchell had it in spades. The courthouse loomed ahead as they pulled up, a monolith of gleaming glass and cold steel rising against the gray sky. It was supposed to stand for fairness, a beacon of order, but to Mitchell, it was something else entirely, a grand theater, a stage where power strutted and preened beneath the guise of law. He'd walked its polished halls countless times, his boots echoing with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight he'd picked. Every case, every showdown, had ended the same, him standing tall. Untouchable, while the world bent to his will. Today, he assumed, would be no different. He'd stride in, take his seat, and watch the predictable script play out, a loudmouth defendant. A few empty objections, and another victory notched on his belt. But then he saw her. Naomi Carter stood in the courtroom like a storm waiting to break. Her presence filling the space without effort. She was tall, her posture unyielding, her dark eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. Confidence radiated from her, not the brash. Loud kind Mitchell was used to crushing, but a quieter, deeper sort, one that didn't need to prove itself. It unnerved him, though he'd never admit it aloud. He'd heard of her before. Whispers of her name floating through precinct gossip and newspaper headlines. She wasn't just another defense attorney spouting platitudes or an activist waving signs, she was a reckoning. She'd toppled corrupt departments, exposed officers like him, men who'd thought themselves invincible. But hearing about her was one thing, standing in her shadow was another. Their eyes locked as he stepped into the room, and the air thickened with something electric, something alive. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down without a word. Mitchell's chest tightened, a primal instinct kicking in. He lived for this, for war, for the clash of wills. So when Naomi rose to speak, her voice steady and clear as she dismantled everything he'd built, every brick of his carefully crafted empire, it didn't scare him. It ignited him. She called out his methods, his abuses. His reign of terror, laying them bare before the room with surgical precision. His pulse quickened, a fire licking at his insides, not fear, but a burning need to put her in her place. He stepped closer as he responded, his voice low and laced with menace, letting the full weight of his authority press down on her. He expected her to flinch, to falter under the pressure. To show some crack in that infuriating calm. But she didn't. She stood there, unshaken, her gaze meeting his with a defiance that clawed at his gut. Something snapped inside him then. A dam breaking under the strain. Before he could think, before he could stop himself, his boot lashed out, striking her with a force that echoed through the room. The courtroom erupted. Gasps ricocheted off the walls, the judge's gavel slammed down like thunder, and voices rose in a chaotic swell of shock and fury. Mitchell barely heard it. His heart hammered against his ribs. His vision narrowing to a pinpoint as adrenaline surged through him. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, the reality of what he'd done sinking in like a stone. He'd crossed a line, publicly. Irreversibly, and yet there she was, still standing, her posture unbroken, her eyes still locked on his. Then the doors swung open, and the world tilted. The figures who strode in weren't just cops or courthouse lackeys, they were the city's true power brokers, men and women whose influence stretched far beyond the badge. And at their head was Naomi Carter, her expression unreadable but her presence undeniable. She wasn't here as a lawyer or an agitator. She was here as his superior, his new commander. For the first time in his life, Richard Mitchell felt the cold grip of fear tighten around his throat. He sank into his seat, the air around him heavy, suffocating. The courtroom's chatter faded to a low hum, then a silence so thick it pressed against his eardrums. His pulse thundered, a relentless drumbeat as he stared at her, this woman he'd dismissed. This woman he'd struck. She wasn't just a threat, she was the reckoning he'd never seen coming. The realization gnawed at him, a slow, sickening dread that spread through his veins like poison. Naomi stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her authority effortless in a way that made his stomach churn. She didn't need to shout or posture, she simply was. And that made her more dangerous than anyone he'd ever faced. The judge's voice broke through the haze, sharp and commanding, but Mitchell couldn't focus on the words. His eyes stayed on Naomi. Searching for a flaw, some hint of weakness, some flicker of doubt. There was nothing. Just that steady, piercing gaze, watching him with a calm that bordered on mockery. Then she smirked. A tiny curve of her lips that hit him like a slap. Rage flared in his chest, hot and bitter, twisting with the humiliation of being laid bare. He'd put her down. Asserted his dominance, or so he'd thought, and yet here she was, towering over him, owning the room in a way he never could. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to reassert the control slipping through his fingers. But he was paralyzed, trapped by the weight of his actions and the shift in power he couldn't deny. Then she spoke. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice smooth as silk but hard as iron, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" The room held its breath, every eye boring into him, peeling him apart. For the first time, he felt small, exposed, the predator turned prey. He forced himself to sit straighter, pride clawing its way through the fog of shock. His jaw tightened. His lips curling into a sneer as he spat out, "You think this changes anything?" A ripple of soft laughter spread through the onlookers, and his stomach twisted. Naomi tilted her head. Her expression almost playful, but there was a glint in her eyes, something patient, something lethal. "Oh, Officer Mitchell," she said, her tone dripping with quiet menace. "You have no idea how much has changed." The gavel fell, the hearing ended, and the ground beneath him crumbled. By the time he reached the precinct, the news had spread like wildfire. Whispers followed him through the halls, glances darted his way, some curious, some gleeful, some wary. Tim trailed behind, his usual chatter replaced by a heavy silence, his eyes fixed on the floor. The kid had seen it all, had watched his idol fall, and Mitchell could feel the fracture in that fragile loyalty widening with every step. Mitchell slumped into a chair at his desk. The precinct buzzing around him like a hive. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, he told himself, but from the rage still simmering beneath his skin. He'd built his life on control, on bending the world to his will, but now that world was slipping away, reshaped by a woman who'd turned his own power against him. Justice, he'd always thought, was a tool for the weak, a lie to keep the masses in line. But as Naomi's shadow loomed larger in his mind, he began to see it differently. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force. And when wielded by someone like her, it could topple even the mightiest. For years, he'd abused his authority, believing himself untouchable, above consequence. Now, those consequences had a name, a face, and a will stronger than his own. The lesson burned deep: power unchecked was a fragile thing, and when it shattered, it left nothing but wreckage in its wake. Mitchell trudged down the precinct hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing off the scuffed linoleum floor, a sound that usually brought him a sense of ownership. Today, though, the air felt different, charged with something bitter and unfamiliar. As he passed his fellow officers, some smirked openly, their lips curling with barely concealed glee, while others averted their eyes, staring at the ground or the walls as if he were a ghost they didn't dare acknowledge. The weight of their gazes, or lack thereof, pressed against his skin, prickling like 1,000 tiny needles. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, this relentless scrutiny that seemed to peel back every layer of armor he'd spent years forging. It made his stomach churn, a sickening twist of unease he couldn't shake. When he reached his office, his sanctuary, his fortress, the space felt alien. The walls, once a comforting barrier between him and the chaos of the world, now loomed inward, shrinking the room into something suffocatingly small. The air hung thick and stale, heavy with the scent of old coffee and dust, pressing down on his chest until every breath felt like a struggle. He dropped into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and stared at the mess of paperwork strewn across his desk. Reports, case files, memos, all of it blurred into a jumble of meaningless scribbles, as if the words themselves had turned against him. For the first time in years, a strange, clawing sensation gripped him, uncertainty. It gnawed at his insides, sharp and relentless, a beast he didn't know how to fight. The door burst open without so much as a knock, the sound jarring him upright. Naomi Carter stepped into the room, her presence filling the space like a storm rolling in over an open plain. She stood in his doorway, shoulders squared, chin lifted, radiating a confidence that made his gut twist painfully. In that moment, he realized with a nauseating clarity that she didn't just belong here, she owned it. He shoved his chair back with a scrape, forcing his face into a mask of indifference, though his pulse hammered in his ears. "What do you want?" he growled, his voice rough with defiance he didn't fully feel. Naomi didn't flinch. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a gunshot. "Let's get one thing straight, Mitchell," she said, her tone smooth and deliberate, each word landing like a stone in still water. "You don't ask me what I want. I ask you." His jaw tightened, teeth grinding together as a surge of anger flared in his chest. She took a step closer, her heels clicking against the floor, her voice dropping to a low, cutting edge that sliced through the air. "You think you can just waltz in here and," he started, but she cut him off. Her words swift and precise, a blade slipping between his ribs. "I don't think," she said, her eyes locking onto his, unyielding and inescapable. "I know. And you should know, too. Because from this moment on, every move you make, every case you touch, every report you file, every second you spend in this department, is mine to judge. Your leash just got shorter, Officer Mitchell. A lot shorter." He shot to his feet, the chair skidding back as his chest tightened with a fury that felt like it might split him open. "This is my precinct," he spat, his voice trembling with the weight of years spent building his empire. "I've been running things here for," Naomi didn't let him finish. "And that," she said, her voice cool and unshaken, "is exactly why I'm here." Silence fell between them, thick and oppressive, a living thing that wrapped around his throat and squeezed. Mitchell knew this game, he'd played it 100 times himself. Power plays, intimidation, bending people until they broke without ever raising a hand. He'd reveled in it, watching men and women shrink under his gaze. But now, the tables had turned, and the bitter taste of his own tactics burned in his mouth. Naomi's stare didn't waver, her dark eyes piercing through him, and for the first time, he felt the sting of being the one cornered. Then she turned and left, her departure as sudden as her arrival, leaving him alone in the wreckage of his own office. He sank back into his chair, the leather creaking under him like a groan of defeat. His mind raced, a chaotic swirl of anger, disbelief, and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to fear. This couldn't be the end. It wouldn't be. But the whispers started almost immediately, slithering through the precinct like a venomous wind. In the break room, he caught snippets of conversation as he passed by, the words sharp and mocking. "Did you hear? Mitchell's on probation." Karma finally caught up with him. A low chuckle followed. "You think she's gonna fire him?" Another voice, smug and certain, "Oh, she's definitely gonna fire him." The hallway carried more murmurs, the locker room buzzing with barely concealed amusement. His own officers, men and women he'd trained, commanded, molded, now looked at him with smirks or sidelong glances, their respect replaced by something gleeful and cruel. The humiliation was a weight he'd never known, a crushing force that pressed down on his shoulders until he felt smaller than he ever had. For years, he'd been untouchable, a king in his own domain. His reputation a shield no one dared to breach, his authority a law unto itself. Now, he was the punchline, the cautionary tale whispered over styrofoam cups of burnt coffee. And it didn't stop there. Cases he'd closed with a heavy hand were being pried open again, their dusty files dragged into the light. Complaints he'd dismissed with a sneer, reports he'd buried deep in the system. Stories he'd silenced, they were all clawing their way back to the surface. Naomi wasn't just coming for him, she was tearing down the empire he'd built brick by brick, exposing every crack, every sin. The fear that gripped him now was unlike anything he'd ever felt, a raw, visceral thing that sank into his bones and refused to let go. He'd never faced consequences, not truly. But now, they were here, drowning him in their unrelenting tide, and the worst was yet to come. Days later, he found himself summoned to Naomi Carter's office. A sterile space that felt more like a courtroom than a workplace. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every step he took, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, casting harsh shadows across the room. His chest was a knot of rage and disbelief, tangled with a thread of dread he couldn't untie. He'd spent his career wielding power like a club, striding through life with the unshakable belief that no one could touch him. Every case he'd manipulated, every complaint he'd crushed, every challenge he'd met with the system's unwavering support, it had all reinforced his certainty, his invincibility. But now, that certainty was unraveling, slipping through his fingers like sand. And the chair he sank into felt less like a seat and more like a cage. Across the desk sat Naomi, her presence commanding the room without effort. She leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, her dark suit crisp against the muted tones of the office. The calmness in her expression was infuriating, an effortless confidence that screamed victory before the battle had even begun. Mitchell hated it, hated the way she seemed to see right through him. Hated the way she'd turned his own game against him. He'd spent years making people squirm, street toughs, nervous rookies, civilians who dared to question his word. He'd broken them all, relishing the power that came with watching them shrink. And Naomi? He'd tried to break her once, too, in a courtroom packed with onlookers, dismissing her as nothing more than a nuisance to be crushed. But she hadn't broken. She'd risen, higher and stronger, and now she sat above him, her gaze steady and unrelenting. The silence stretched on, heavy with the ghosts of every choice that had led them here. Mitchell clenched his fists against his thighs, his knuckles widening as he forced himself to meet her eyes. He wouldn't look away, wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him falter. When Naomi finally spoke, her voice was smooth as glass, controlled and devoid of the anger she had every right to wield. "Sit," she said, the command simple yet grating, scraping against his pride like coarse sandpaper. His spine stiffened, every muscle screaming to defy her, to stand his ground, but what ground did he have left? Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered himself into the chair, his body rigid with a fury he could barely contain. She watched him settle, her patience a quiet weapon, letting the silence linger until it became a pressure all its own. Then she spoke again, her tone soft but laced with a confidence that made his skin crawl. "You've been here a long time, haven't you, Mitchell?" His jaw ached from clenching so hard. "You know damn well I have." He snapped, the words bitter on his tongue. Naomi tilted her head slightly, a faint hum escaping her lips as her fingers tapped idly against the desk. A casual rhythm that belied the storm brewing beneath her calm. "That's what makes this so fascinating," she said, her voice almost reflective. "All those years, all that power, and yet, here we are." The words hit him like a punch, a raw reminder of how quickly his world had crumbled. His patience shattered, the anger he'd kept simmering erupting into a boil. "Just get to it," he barked, leaning forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "You dragged me in here, so say whatever the hell you're gonna say." A flicker of something, amusement, maybe, danced in her eyes. But it wasn't warm or light. It was the kind of look a predator gave its prey, knowing the trap was already set. She reached for a folder on her desk, flipping it open with slow, deliberate care, each movement stretching the tension in the room until it felt unbearable. Let's talk about your record, Mitchell, she said, her voice smooth and almost conversational. But there was a razor-sharp edge beneath it that sent a chill racing down his spine. Let's talk about the complaints, dozens of them, piling up over the years. The use of force reports you shrugged off, the excessive aggression you called necessary, the arrests that never quite added up. Let's talk about how, despite all of that, you've never faced a single consequence. Not once. His stomach lurched, a violent twist that left him breathless. He'd known this was coming, had braced himself for the accusations. But hearing them laid out so plainly, so ruthlessly, was like a hammer striking glass. She wasn't just accusing him, she was building a case, brick by damning brick. Naomi turned a page. Her movements unhurried, her gaze lifting to pin him in place. You were protected, she continued, her voice steady and unrelenting. Insulated by a system that let you do whatever you wanted. Whenever you wanted. You thought that shield would hold forever. She paused, letting the words sink in, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that made him feel exposed, raw. But it won't. Not anymore. In that moment, the lesson was clear, etched into the air between them. Justice, when it came, was unrelenting. A force that cared little for the empires men built on the backs of others. Mitchell had abused his power, wielded it like a god among mortals, believing the consequences would never find him. But they had, in the form of Naomi Carter, a woman he'd underestimated, a woman who now held his fate in her hands. And as the weight of her words settled over him, he understood something else: power. When stripped away, left nothing but the hollow shell of the man who'd once held it. The storm was here, and it was only beginning to break. The room seemed to pulse with Mitchell's heartbeat. A relentless thudding that hammered against the inside of his skull as though it might crack open at any moment. The walls, once a neutral gray, now loomed closer. Their edges blurring into a suffocating cage. The air clung to his lungs, dense and unyielding, each breath a struggle against an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. He could feel the sweat beading along his brow, a cold trickle that mirrored the dread pooling in his gut. He had to fight back, had to claw his way out from under her grip before she buried him alive. His voice rasped out, low and jagged, laced with a danger he hoped she'd feel in her bones. You're twisting this into something it's not. You know damn well this isn't about my record. This is personal, don't pretend it isn't. Naomi sat across the desk, her presence an unshakable monolith in the storm of his unraveling. Her dark eyes didn't waver. Didn't flicker with even a hint of doubt. She was steady, deliberate, a woman who had walked into this moment with the calm certainty of someone holding all the cards. Slowly. She closed the manila folder in front of her, the soft snap of it shutting reverberating through the room like the closing of a coffin lid. Her hands folded neatly atop the desk. Fingers interlocking with a grace that belied the steel beneath. Her face remained a mask, unreadable, impenetrable, yet there was a quiet power in the way she held herself. A stillness that made Mitchell's skin crawl. You're right, she said, her voice smooth and measured, each syllable landing like a stone in still water. It is personal. But not in the way you're imagining. She paused, letting the words settle, her gaze pinning him in place. This isn't about some petty grudge. You're not the first to sit in that chair, Mitchell. And you won't be the last. But you will be the example everyone remembers. Her words sliced through him, sharp and cold, igniting a jolt of panic that raced down his spine like lightning. This wasn't a warning shot fired across his bow, this was an executioner's blade hovering above his neck. His breath hitched, growing shorter, harsher. As though the oxygen in the room had turned to ash. He leaned forward, the edge of the desk biting into his palms, his voice dropping to a rough, trembling whisper that betrayed the storm raging inside him. What the hell are you saying, Naomi? His eyes searched hers, desperate for a crack in her armor. A sign that this was some kind of bluff he could outmaneuver. But she didn't flinch. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the weight of the moment. Her lips parting just enough to let the air escape before she delivered the blow that would shatter his world into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You're being indicted, Mitchell. Officially." The room tilted violently, the floor beneath his chair seeming to lurch as though the earth itself had turned against him. His body froze, every muscle locking tight. His mind recoiling from the word that echoed in his skull like a gunshot, *indicted, indicted, indicted star. It crashed into him with the force of a sledgehammer, splintering his ribs, crushing the air from his lungs. His throat constricted, a vice tightening until he could barely swallow, his hands trembling despite his every effort to still them. This wasn't a threat or a game. This was real, terrifyingly, irreversibly real. The walls pressed closer, the power he'd spent his life clutching slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time, Mitchell felt the ground vanish beneath him, leaving him dangling over an abyss with no way back. His voice emerged hoarse, desperate, teetering on the edge of something he refused to name as fear. "You think you can do this to me? To me?" Naomi didn't blink. She didn't shift in her seat or raise her voice to match his. She simply watched him. Her calm and unshakable fortress against his rising tide of panic. "I don't think, Mitchell," she said, her tone as steady as a judge's gavel. "I know." The certainty in her words clawed at his throat, sinking into his lungs, his very soul. He'd faced down hardened criminals, stared into the chaos of riots, laughed off death threats scrawled in shaky handwriting, but this was different. This wasn't a fight he could muscle through or talk his way out of. Naomi Carter wasn't threatening him with empty promises or hollow bravado. She was wielding justice, pure and unyielding. And it terrified him more than any gun ever had. He shoved himself up from the chair, the motion abrupt and unsteady, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his chest. His entire body felt alight with fury, humiliation searing through his veins like molten lead. The loss, the sheer, unbearable loss, was something he'd never tasted before. And it fueled a rage that made his hands shake at his sides. "This is a goddamn witch hunt," he spat, his voice quaking with the anger he could no longer contain. The words dripping with venom as he glared at her. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't rise to meet his outburst or snap back with the indignation he half expected. She just sat there, unruffled. Composed, her control over the moment absolute. "No, Mitchell," she said simply, her voice cutting through his tirade like a blade through silk. "This is justice." He stormed toward the door. Each step a thunderclap against the linoleum, his world crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. The walls seemed to groan with the weight of his defeat. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry hornets. And then came her final strike, delivered with a calm that made it all the more devastating. "Oh, and Mitchell?" Her voice rang out, firm and unshaken, stopping him dead in his tracks. His fingers tightened around the door handle, the cold metal biting into his skin as his pulse roared in his ears. A deafening drumbeat of dread. "Turn in your badge. You won't be needing it anymore." His grip turned to iron, his knuckles whitening as the words sank in. Each one a nail driven into the coffin of his career, his identity, his life. The fire in his chest flared hotter, a slow, excruciating burn that consumed him, rage, humiliation. Disbelief twisting together into something unbearable. Turn in your badge. You won't be needing it anymore. The finality of it was a guillotine's drop, absolute and merciless. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, his heart slamming against his ribcage as though it might break free. He wanted to whirl around, to scream. To deny the reality crashing down on him, but deep inside, in a shadowed corner of his soul he refused to face, he knew there was no escaping this. No favors left to call in, no connections to lean on. No loopholes to slither through. Naomi had sealed every exit, and the silence that followed her words was suffocating, thick with the weight of every choice. Every abuse of power that had led him here. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or revel in his downfall. She didn't need to. The power in the room had shifted entirely to her. And Mitchell was drowning in the void it left behind. His whole life, he'd been the one holding the reins, deciding who rose and who fell, bending the rules to suit his needs. Standing untouchable while others crumbled beneath his boots. But now, he was the one stripped bare, reduced to nothing more than a disgraced officer forced to confront the wreckage of his own making. His voice, when it finally clawed its way out, was raw, jagged, laced with a desperation that felt too close to fear for his liking. "You think this is justice?" His hand stayed locked on the handle. His body rigid, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. "This isn't justice. This is revenge." Naomi exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair with a grace that only amplified her authority. She folded her hands in front of her, regarding him with a look that held neither cruelty nor mercy, just an unyielding finality. "Revenge," she echoed, her voice smooth and deliberate. As though she'd anticipated his accusation long before he'd hurled it at her. "No, Mitchell. This is accountability, something you've dodged your entire career." Her words hung in the air. Heavy with truth, and he felt them settle into his bones like lead. He turned to face her fully, his face contorted with fury. His chest heaving as he fought to keep the rage from spilling over completely. "Don't feed me that sanctimonious bullshit," he roared, his voice shaking with the force of his anger. "You wanted to humiliate me, to tear everything I've built away from me, and you did it. Congratulations, Naomi. You won." His fists clenched at his sides. Nails digging into his palms until he felt the sting of broken skin. She remained still, her gaze locked onto his, unflinching in the face of his outburst. "This was never about winning, Mitchell," she said, her tone low and steady, cutting through his chaos with surgical precision. "That's your problem, you see everything as a game, a battle for power, a chance to come out on top. That's why you're standing here now. You never stopped to think about the consequences of your actions. Never considered that the people you trampled might one day stand up and demand what's owed to them." She paused, her expression unreadable. Her eyes boring into him with an intensity that made him want to look away. "That's what justice is, Mitchell, not revenge, not humiliation, but the inevitable result of what you've done." He let out a bitter, jagged laugh, shaking his head as his hands balled tighter. "Justice," he spat, the word tasting like poison on his tongue, a concept so repulsive it made his stomach churn. "You think dragging me down, turning me into some public spectacle, is justice? You think I deserve this?" His voice cracked. The bravado fraying at the edges as the reality of his fall pressed harder against him. Naomi's expression didn't soften, but her gaze hardened, a flicker of something, resolve. Perhaps, passing through her eyes. "You kicked me in a courtroom full of people, Mitchell," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "And that was just the beginning, wasn't it? How many others did you hurt? How many complaints got swept under the rug because you knew the right people? How many lives did you treat like dirt because you thought that badge made you a god?" Her words were a mirror held up to his soul, reflecting every dark corner he'd refused to acknowledge. And for the first time, he felt the full, crushing weight of it, not just what he'd done to her, but to countless others whose names he'd never bothered to learn. His chest rose and fell with ragged, uneven breaths, his hands trembling as he struggled to find a defense, a lie, anything to throw back at her. He wanted to scream that she was wrong. That she'd twisted it all out of proportion, but he couldn't. Because every word she spoke was true, and it clawed at him, tearing through the armor he'd worn for years. His throat tightened, a bitter taste flooding his mouth as he forced the words out, quieter now, but still edged with defiance. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice a shadow of its former strength. "You don't know what it's like to be in my shoes, to do this job, to make split-second calls, to be hated just for wearing the badge." Naomi's eyes flickered, a spark of something raw, anger, maybe. Or a deep, weary disappointment, flashing across her face. "You think I don't know?" she said, her voice dropping lower, steadier, more personal than before. "You think I don't understand what it's like to walk into a room and feel the weight of everyone's judgment before I even speak? To know they've already decided who I am, what I'm worth?" She let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking her head as though the irony of his words stung her. "The difference is, Mitchell, I never let that be my excuse. I never used it as a shield to hurt people, to break them, to build myself up by stepping on their backs." Her words landed like a final blow, stripping away the last of his defenses. He stood there, hands still gripping the door handle, his body rigid with the tension of a man staring down his own reckoning. The lesson was clear, etched into the silence that followed: power, when abused, forged its own chains, and justice, true justice, was the hand that locked them tight. For Mitchell, the consequences of his actions had finally caught up, and there was no outrunning them now. Mitchell's throat tightened as he swallowed, the effort almost painful, his jaw clenched so hard it felt like his teeth might crack under the strain. Every muscle in his body was rigid, coiled with a tension that seemed to radiate from deep within, a storm of dread and defiance warring inside him. The truth gnawed at him relentlessly, clawing its way through the layers of pride and bravado he'd built up over the years, a suffocating weight pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He wanted to lash out, to argue, to shove the accusations back in her face and scream that she had it all wrong, that he wasn't the monster she painted him to be. But buried beneath the arrogance, beneath the unchecked power he'd wielded like a scepter, a quiet, undeniable voice whispered that she wasn't mistaken. And that realization burned worse than anything else. Naomi stood before him, her movements measured and deliberate, each step carrying the weight of finality. Her voice was steady, cutting through the thick air like a blade. "Your indictment is official. You're suspended immediately, pending trial. Your badge, your gun, turn them in before the day's end." The words landed like a physical blow, and Mitchell's breath hitched, caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. He'd seen this coming, felt the storm brewing for weeks, maybe months, but hearing it spoken aloud was a different beast entirely. It was as if the ground beneath him had split open, jagged and unforgiving, swallowing the foundation of his life whole. The air felt thin, stolen from him, and his hands trembled faintly at his sides as the reality sank in. His career, his identity, everything he'd poured himself into, was being stripped away, piece by brutal piece. And he was powerless to stop it. Naomi stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, unyielding and piercing. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no flicker of doubt. "This is what happens when power is abused," she said, her tone low but resolute. "This is what happens when people like you convince themselves they're untouchable, that consequences don't apply." Her words weren't just an accusation, they were a lesson, a stark reminder of the justice she believed in, the kind he'd dismissed as naive for years. Mitchell's voice rasped out, hoarse and fragile, barely above a whisper. "And what happens to me now?" It was less a question and more a plea, a desperate grasp at some shred of control. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm that felt almost cruel in its certainty. She let the silence stretch, her expression unreadable, before she answered. "You live with it." The simplicity of her response hit him like a sledgehammer. His stomach lurched, a crushing heaviness settling over his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Behind him, The door loomed, both a lifeline and a guillotine. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight back, to roar that this wasn't fair, that he didn't deserve this unraveling of his life. But as he met Naomi's gaze, unflinching and resolute, he saw the cold, unvarnished truth reflected there: the battle was over. He'd lost. With a slow, mechanical turn of his wrist, he gripped the door handle, his movement stiff and hollow, like a condemned man trudging toward the gallows. The door creaked open, and he stepped into the hallway. The precinct buzzing around him like it always had, phones ringing, voices murmuring, the clatter of keyboards. Yet the moment his boots hit the tiled floor, the shift was palpable. Eyes darted toward him, sharp and judgmental, slicing through the air like knives. Whispers slithered through the space, too low to catch fully but loud enough to sting. Officers who once snapped to attention in his presence now stared with a mix of disdain and morbid curiosity, their expressions twisting his gut. He wasn't the towering figure anymore. The one they feared and respected. He was just another disgraced cop, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. The hallway stretched endlessly before him as he made his way toward his office. Each step heavier than the last. The murmurs followed, relentless and insidious, weaving through the air like a venomous thread. He caught fragments, harsh, biting words that sank into him deeper than he'd ever admit. "Karma's a real piece of work, huh?" one voice muttered, laced with grim satisfaction. "Never thought I'd see Mitchell get what's coming to him," another added, a hint of glee threading through the tone. "Think he'll fight it? Doesn't seem like the type to go quiet." Someone else speculated, their voice dripping with skepticism. Each syllable fueled the fire raging in his chest, urging him to spin around, to snarl at them. To remind them who he'd been, who he still was, damn it. But the words wouldn't come. His voice, his authority, his power, they'd evaporated, leaving him hollow. He'd spent years striding through these halls with his head high, shoulders squared, his presence commanding the space like he owned it. That certainty had been his armor. Forged by a system that propped him up, shielded him, let him bend rules and break boundaries without a second thought. Now that system had turned its back, casting him out like a pariah. The realization gnawed at him as he reached his office door, his hand hesitating on the knob. Inside, he found Reynolds, young, sharp-eyed Reynolds, lounging at his desk. Flipping through a file with a casualness that grated on Mitchell's frayed nerves. The younger officer looked up, and there it was, pity. Not anger, not triumph, but a quiet, infuriating pity that made Mitchell's blood boil. He slammed the door shut behind him, the sharp click reverberating in the stifling silence. "Say whatever the hell you're gonna say, Reynolds," he snapped, his voice rougher than he'd meant, edged with a desperation he couldn't mask. Reynolds sighed, setting the file down with deliberate care, his movements slow and measured. "I don't have anything to say, Mitch." The nickname, once a sign of camaraderie, now felt like a taunt, and Mitchell's temper flared. "Bullshit," he spat, stepping closer, his hands curling into fists. "I know what you're thinking. You're sitting there, smug as hell, thinking, finally, the great Richard Mitchell got what he deserved. Admit it." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slowly, his gaze steady but not hostile. "I don't know, man. Maybe this was always gonna happen. Maybe it was just a matter of time." The words were soft, but they cut deep, stoking the bitterness churning in Mitchell's gut. He scoffed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You sound like one of them now," he sneered, jabbing a finger toward the door. Toward the precinct filled with officers he'd once dismissed as weak. Reynolds' eyes hardened, just a flicker, but enough to shift the air between them. "Maybe I was always one of them," he said. His voice low and firm, a quiet challenge woven into the words. The statement landed like a fist to Mitchell's chest, knocking the wind out of him. For the first time, he saw it, the slow, steady shift that had been happening right under his nose. The younger cops, the ones he'd mocked for their idealism, their insistence on rules and fairness and justice, they weren't the ones crumbling. He was. His hand raked through his hair, fingers digging into his scalp as if he could claw his way out of this nightmare. "You don't get it, Reynolds," he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous edge. "You think this is justice? You think what Carter did was some noble stand? She wanted me gone. This wasn't about right or wrong, it was about her winning." Reynolds tilted his head, considering him with a scrutiny that made Mitchell's skin crawl. "And what about you, Mitchell? What was it about for you, all those years?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. And Mitchell's mouth opened, ready to fire back. He wanted to say he'd done what was necessary, that the world wasn't some tidy little box of black and white morality. That real authority meant taming the chaos, not bowing to it. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped by the wreckage of his life staring him in the face. Reynolds stood, adjusting his belt with a casual ease that felt like a slap. "I used to look up to you, you know," he said, his tone devoid of anger or mockery, just a quiet, piercing honesty that stung worse than any insult. "Thought you were the kind of cop I wanted to be. But now? I don't know, man. Maybe we were never meant to be the same." Mitchell had no response, no defense to offer. Reynolds brushed past him, pausing at the door just long enough to twist the knife one last time. "Turn in your badge, Mitchell. It's over." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in Mitchell's bones. He sank into his chair, his body aching as if he'd been battered, the weight of everything pressing down until he could hardly move. The whispers outside grew louder, a dull roar he couldn't escape. But they faded into background noise as he stared at the badge on his desk. That small, gleaming piece of metal had been his anchor, his crown. The symbol of a power he'd wielded with reckless abandon. It had defined him, elevated him, made him untouchable, or so he'd thought. Now it sat there, lifeless and cold. A relic of a life he could no longer claim. The truth settled over him, icy and relentless. He'd spent years convinced he was above the law, above consequences, above the very justice he'd sworn to uphold. He'd bent the world to his will, believing no one could topple him from his throne. But Naomi Carter had proven him wrong, dismantling his empire with a quiet, unshakable resolve. And the worst part, the part that gnawed at him until he could barely breathe, was that deep down, in the shadowed corners of his soul he'd long ignored, he knew he'd earned every ounce of this ruin. His fingers brushed the badge, tracing its edges, the metal suddenly too heavy, too alien in his grip. A knock at the door jolted him, faint but insistent, followed by a voice, calm, inevitable. "Mitchell, it's time." His hand tightened around the badge for a fleeting moment, clinging to the last shred of what he'd been. Then, with a slow, shuddering exhale, he set it down, the soft thunk against the wood ringing like a death knell. He pushed himself to his feet, legs leaden, body moving on instinct as he reached for the door. The precinct waited beyond, a world he no longer belonged to, and as he turned the handle, he stepped into the consequences of his own making, a fallen king stripped bare by the justice he'd mocked for far too long. As Mitchell stepped out into the open, the air felt thick, saturated with the weight of countless eyes, eyes that once trembled at the mere mention of his name. These were the people who had cowered under his shadow, who had bent beneath the force of his will. But now, as their gazes pierced through him, he didn't feel the familiar surge of anger that had fueled him for years, nor the arrogance that had armored him against doubt, nor even the defiance that had kept him standing tall through every storm. Instead, an unfamiliar sensation clawed at his chest, a hollow, gnawing emptiness that seemed to swallow him whole. It was as though the ground beneath his polished boots had turned to quicksand, each step sinking him deeper into a mire of his own making. His legs trembled under an invisible burden, not just the physical strain of movement, but the crushing weight of his past, his choices, and the sprawling empire he'd spent decades forging. Only to watch it crumble into ash. Every inch he crossed felt like a mile, his breaths shallow and ragged, as if the air itself refused to fill his lungs. His heart hammered against his ribcage. Each beat a brutal, relentless drumroll echoing the truth he could no longer escape. This was real. This was happening. There was no rewinding the clock, no unmaking the wreckage he'd left behind. The precinct walls, those towering slabs of concrete he'd once strode past with his chin held high and his authority radiating like a crown, now loomed over him like the bars of a cage. They weren't just walls anymore, they were a prison, locking him inside the very consequences he'd spent his entire career outrunning. Once, he'd been a king here, feared and revered in equal measure. His power not just a product of the badge pinned to his chest but of the way he wielded it, ruthless, unyielding, absolute. Now, those same halls stretched out before him, cold and unfamiliar. Stripping him bare of everything that had once made him untouchable. The air buzzed with whispers, a low hum that slithered through the space like smoke curling from a smoldering fire. The voices didn't need to be loud for him to feel their sting, they grew bolder with every step he took, feeding off his downfall like scavengers circling a dying beast. He didn't have to catch the words to know what they were saying, their meaning was etched into the faces around him. Some stared with barely concealed glee. Their lips twitching into smirks they no longer bothered to hide, their eyes glinting with a sharp, bitter satisfaction that set his skin ablaze with shame. They'd been waiting for this moment. Every single one of them, biding their time for the day the Titan would fall. Others watched with a cautious curiosity. Their heads tilted as if committing the scene to memory, the collapse of a man they'd once believed invincible. And then there were those who refused to look at him at all. Their gazes locked on the papers strewn across their desks or the worn tiles beneath their feet, as if his presence was no longer worth acknowledging. Those were the ones who cut the deepest. To them, he was already a ghost, a relic of a world they'd moved on from without a second thought. That realization sank into him like a stone, cold and suffocating. Settling into his bones until he felt he might collapse under its weight. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out before him like a gauntlet of judgment. At its end stood Naomi. Her silhouette a stark contrast against the dim light filtering through the precinct's windows. She wasn't tucked away behind a desk this time, shielded by the trappings of bureaucracy and rank. No. She stood there in the open, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing. But Mitchell knew better than to think she was unaffected. She'd won. After all, won in a way that didn't require gloating or grand gestures. Her victory was in her silence, in the way she dismantled his world without ever raising her voice. He stopped a few feet from her, his body rigid, his hands curling into fists so tight his knuckles ached. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, and a storm of words churned in his throat, anger. Humiliation, desperation, all tangled together, choking him silent. He wanted to lash out, to demand answers, to claw back some shred of control, but the weight of her presence pinned him in place. Naomi tilted her head, her eyes locking onto his with a precision that made his stomach twist. They were sharp, unflinching, cutting through the haze of his fury like a blade. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice low and steady, carrying a quiet authority that hit him harder than any shout ever could. "You never thought this day would come, did you?" The words weren't a taunt, they were a statement, heavy with the certainty of someone who'd seen this ending long before he had. Mitchell's jaw clenched until it throbbed. His chest heaving as heat surged through him. He wanted to fight back, to deny it, to hurl something venomous in her direction, but what could he say? What defense did he have left? He'd lost everything, his power, his pride, his place, and the truth of it burned like acid in his veins. "I don't know what you want me to say," he rasped, his voice rough and jagged, laced with a raw edge he couldn't name. It was the sound of a man teetering on the brink, grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't shift her stance. "I don't want you to say anything, Mitchell," she replied, her tone as unshakable as stone. "I want you to understand." His teeth ground together, the ache in his jaw spreading to his temples. "Understand what?" he snapped, his voice rising, sharp with a fury he could barely contain. "That you set me up? That you turned everyone against me?" The accusation hung in the air. Brittle and desperate, but Naomi remained a statue, her expression untouched by his rage. She let out a soft, humorless laugh, a sound so faint it barely registered, shaking her head as if he were a child who'd missed the point entirely. "You still don't get it, do you?" Her eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "No one had to turn against you, Mitchell. You did that all by yourself. You spent years building a throne out of enemies, convincing yourself you were untouchable. That nothing could ever bring you down. You thought you could bend the world to your will, break whoever you wanted, whenever you wanted, and the system would always have your back." She paused, letting the words sink in, her gaze never wavering. "But the system doesn't belong to you anymore." His chest heaved, each breath a struggle as his body coiled tighter, every muscle trembling with the urge to explode. "You think I was the problem?" he shot back, his voice rough and mocking, dripping with defiance. "You think I was the only one who did what needed to be done? The world's a mess, Carter. You think you can fix it by tearing me down? You think that makes you the hero?" His fists tightened, nails digging into his palms until he felt the sting of broken skin. Naomi's expression didn't shift, but something colder flickered in her eyes, something lethal, unyielding. "I don't care about being the hero, Mitchell," she said, her voice quiet but firm, slicing through his bluster like a knife. "I care about making sure men like you don't get to keep deciding who lives, who dies, who matters, and who doesn't." Her words landed like a blow, striking at a truth he'd buried deep beneath layers of bravado and justification. Because she was right, he'd spent years wielding power like a weapon, choosing who was worthy of mercy and who deserved none, convinced the rules were his to rewrite. He'd believed himself above consequence, a god among men, until the system he'd trusted to shield him turned its back. Now, the reckoning had arrived, and it wore Naomi's face. She stepped closer, her presence towering despite her smaller frame, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that made his throat close up. "I don't care if you hate me," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I don't care if you spend the rest of your miserable life cursing my name. But know this was always going to happen. The only difference is that, for once, someone like you didn't get to walk away." Mitchell's vision blurred at the edges, his breath uneven as the world tilted beneath him. He'd spent his life believing he held the reins, that he dictated the moves on the board. But now, he wasn't even a piece in the game, just a shadow cast off the table, irrelevant and forgotten. Behind him, the precinct doors stood open, the faint hum of the outside world seeping in. For the first time in decades, stepping through them wouldn't mean striding out as a cop, a enforcer, a man to be feared. It meant leaving as a disgrace, a hollow shell of the titan he'd once been. Naomi said nothing more, she didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any parting shot. As he took those final steps, the hallway seemed to stretch into infinity, the faces lining its length a gallery of judgment. Some smirked openly now, their whispers rising into a chorus. "He's actually leaving. Can you believe it?" After all these years, others turned away, their indifference a sharper blade than any mockery. His hands stayed balled at his sides. His chest tight with a rage that had no outlet, no target. The glass doors loomed ahead, reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized, shoulders slumped, stance unsteady, a man diminished. The precinct, once his fortress, now closed in around him, its walls whispering of every abuse, every overreach, every life he'd crushed under the weight of his unchecked power. Justice. He realized too late, wasn't just a word, it was a force, patient and relentless, and it had finally come for him. The lesson burned into his soul as he crossed the threshold: power, when twisted and hoarded, didn't just destroy others, it devoured its wielder, leaving nothing but a husk behind. The air felt thick and suffocating as Richard Mitchell trudged forward, his heavy boots scuffing against the worn pavement. Once, every step he took carried the weight of authority, each stride a declaration of ownership over the space he occupied. People parted for him then, their eyes flickering with a mix of fear and respect. But now, his shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. And his gait faltered as though the ground itself rejected him. He was a man unmoored, stripped bare of everything that had once defined him, his badge, his title, his power. Loss clawed at his chest. A hollow ache that grew sharper with every breath, and yet, as if fate wasn't done twisting the knife, a voice sliced through the silence behind him. Mitchell. The sound stopped him cold. It was her, Naomi Carter, her tone steady and piercing, like a blade honed by years of resolve. For a fleeting moment, he considered ignoring it, letting his feet carry him away from her and the bitter confrontation he knew was coming. He could almost taste the freedom of walking out, of denying her the satisfaction of seeing him break. But something deep inside him, a smoldering ember of resentment, a stubborn flicker of the fire that had once roared, refused to let him run. Slowly, deliberately, he turned, his body tense as if bracing for a blow. When his eyes met hers, Naomi stood just a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of unreadable calm. Yet the air between them crackled with unspoken finality, a tension so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. His voice rasped out, rough and strained, like gravel grinding underfoot. What? Naomi? The question hung there, laced with defiance he barely felt anymore. She took a slow, measured breath, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Those eyes, dark, unwavering, seemed to see straight through the shell of the man he'd become, peeling back layers he'd spent a lifetime building. You never really thought this would happen, did you? She said. Her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone tossed into still water. His jaw tightened, muscles clenching as a surge of anger flared in his gut. We've already been through this, he snapped, his voice rising despite the tremor beneath it. You want to rub it in a little more, Carter? Twist the knife while I'm down. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him with a quiet scrutiny that only fueled his unease. No, Mitchell, she replied, her tone soft but firm, unshaken by his bitterness. I just want to know one thing. His stomach twisted. A sickening lurch of dread he couldn't name, pulling at him like a current dragging him under. And what's that? He forced out, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. She stepped closer then, closing the small distance between them until nothing remained but the raw, jagged history that bound them. The courtroom flashed in his mind, the moment his hands had gripped her. The fury that had blinded him, the power he'd wielded like a weapon. Now, standing so near, her presence felt like a mirror reflecting every choice he'd made. Now that the badge is gone, she said, her voice low and steady, now that you have nothing left to hide behind, who are you? The question struck him like a physical blow, reverberating through his chest with a force that stole his breath. He opened his mouth, ready to fire back with the sharp retort that had always come so easily. The armor of defiance he'd worn for years. But the words didn't come. For the first time, his tongue felt heavy, useless. As if the truth he'd buried beneath layers of bravado had finally clawed its way to the surface. The badge had been his shield, his identity. The source of the control he'd craved and the fear he'd commanded. Without it, what was he? His throat tightened, dry and raw, as a wave of something dangerously close to panic gripped him. "You think you've won, don't you?" he muttered, his voice cracking under the strain. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Mitchell," she said, her calm slicing through his turmoil like a blade. This was never about winning. The steadiness in her words only stoked the fire in his belly, a helpless rage burning hotter with every syllable. This was about accountability, something you never thought you'd have to face. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms as he fought to hold on to the fraying threads of his composure. "I did what had to be done," he growled, the words spilling out like a plea he didn't mean to voice. "You don't know what it's like, Carter. You sit behind that desk, passing judgment, pretending you understand what it means to be out there, to make the hard calls. But you don't. You never will." Naomi exhaled, a faint shake of her head betraying the frustration she kept tightly reined. "You still don't get it," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, sharp and unrelenting. "It's not about the job, Mitchell. It's about the way you did it, the people you hurt, the power you abused, the lines you crossed because you thought no one would ever hold you accountable." Her words pressed against him, a weight so heavy it threatened to crush the last of his defenses. He wanted to argue, to shout, to drown her out, but his chest felt tight, his breath shallow. As the reality of her accusation sank in. "You don't know what it's like," he repeated, quieter now, desperation creeping into his tone, "to have to make those calls. To control the chaos." Her eyes darkened, her voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more force than any shout. "You didn't control the chaos, Mitchell. You were the chaos." The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed every sound but the pounding of his pulse in his ears. He swallowed hard, his hands flexing uselessly. The fight draining from him as her words echoed in his skull. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur, the question hanging fragile between them. Naomi studied him for a long, agonizing moment, then sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion and something he couldn't quite place. "That's up to you," she said simply, her words settling like stones in the pit of his stomach. Mitchell let out a slow, shaky breath, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to hold himself together. He'd spent his life believing he was the one in control. The one who shaped the world to his will, who decided how every story ended. But now, standing in the wreckage of that illusion, he didn't even know where to begin rebuilding. His voice dropped lower. Quieter, the last embers of defiance flickering out. "And if I don't know how to do that?" Naomi exhaled again, a long, weary sound, and after a pause that stretched into eternity. She shook her head. "Then I guess you finally know how the rest of us felt all these years." The words landed like a final, shattering blow, stripping away whatever pride he had left. He had nothing to say, no defense to offer, no fight to muster. Without another word, he turned away. Pushing through the heavy doors of the building and stepping out into a world that no longer recognized him, a world he no longer recognized himself in. For the first time in his life, Richard Mitchell had no idea where to go. He'd always thought the worst fate for a man like him was losing his power, the authority that had defined every moment of his existence. But he'd been wrong. It wasn't the power he mourned, it was the certainty, the unshakable belief that the world bent to his rules, that he was untouchable. That belief had been torn away, piece by agonizing piece, leaving him with nothing but the bitter sting of a reality he couldn't escape. In the weeks that followed, he wandered through a life that no longer made sense. A stranger in a city he'd once ruled. The trial had been swift and merciless, the evidence a tidal wave that drowned any hope of redemption. The city demanded a scapegoat. And the system he'd once wielded as a shield turned its blade on him without hesitation. The headlines screamed his downfall in bold, unforgiving print. Former officer Richard Mitchell indicted for abuse of power, corrupt cop faces reckoning. His name, once a thunderclap of authority, had become a hiss of contempt or a smug whisper of satisfaction. He was no longer a force to be reckoned with, he was a cautionary tale, a living lesson in the consequences of unchecked power. Naomi Carter watched it all unfold from the sidelines, her face a mask of resolve, not a trace of pity in her eyes. She'd fought too long, bled too much. To waste sympathy on a man who'd built his empire on the backs of others. She didn't gloat, didn't revel in his ruin, but she didn't look away either. This was justice. Not revenge, she'd made that distinction clear from the beginning, and now, as Mitchell stood in the courtroom, the gavel's echo sealing his fate, he finally understood what accountability meant. 5 years. The sentence wasn't long by some standards, but it was enough to strip away the last vestiges of the man he'd been. Enough to leave him powerless in a place where he'd once been king. Inmate number 64732. The number replaced his name. His identity reduced to a string of digits in a system he'd once manipulated with ease. The first weeks behind bars were a brutal awakening. The prison halls echoed with the jeers of men he'd once caged, men he'd dismissed as beneath him, men who now saw him as prey. The tables had turned, and there was no badge, no uniform. No authority to shield him from their retribution. At first, he fought it, walking the corridors with his jaw set and his spine rigid, refusing to bow to the shift in power. But reality was a relentless teacher, and even a man like Mitchell couldn't outrun its lessons forever. He wasn't feared here, wasn't respected. He was just another inmate. Another fool who'd thought himself invincible until the world proved him wrong. Yet prison did something unexpected, it gave him time. Time to sit in the suffocating silence of his cell. Time to stare at the cracked concrete walls and feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. At first, he raged inwardly, blaming Naomi, the system, the world, anyone but himself. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, he began to see the faces of the men around him, men broken by the same machine he'd once served. Men whose lives he'd shattered without a second thought. The truth crept in slowly, insidiously, until he could no longer deny it. He'd built this cage for himself, brick by brick. With every abuse of power, every line he'd crossed. Naomi, meanwhile, pressed on with her work, her mission far from complete. Mitchell was just one name on a list that stretched far beyond him. One battle in a war she'd vowed to fight until the end. The city had shifted in the wake of his fall, a ripple of change spreading through its streets, but there was still so much left to mend. With every case she took, every officer she held to the fire, she forced the system to confront its own rot. She carried no illusions of perfection, but she believed in progress, in the slow, grueling work of justice. And then there was Reynolds, the young officer who'd once idolized Mitchell, trailing in his shadow like a loyal pup. He'd soaked up every lesson Mitchell taught: power was control, strength was dominance, until the day it all unraveled. Standing at the edge of Mitchell's collapse, Reynolds found himself at a crossroads, staring down the wreckage of the man he'd once aspired to be. What he saw wasn't strength or honor, it was corruption, plain and ugly. A twisted mirror of everything he'd been trained to value. The lesson sank deep: power without restraint was a poison, and justice, though slow and imperfect, was an antidote worth fighting for. The sun blazed high in the sky on a sweltering Wednesday afternoon, casting golden beams across the cracked pavement of an aging neighborhood. Lieutenant Sarah Thompson stepped out of her unmarked patrol car, the heat shimmering off the asphalt in waves. She adjusted the crisp edges of her police uniform, her badge glinting briefly in the sunlight. After a grueling meeting at the city police headquarters, her mind buzzed with strategies and unresolved cases, but her body craved a moment of reprieve. A small convenience store on the corner beckoned, a humble, weathered building she'd come to know well over the years. It wasn't much to look at, with its faded sign and chipped paint. But it held a quiet charm for Sarah. She often stopped there to grab a quick snack, exchanging warm words with the clerk, Mr. Singh. An older Indian man whose gentle demeanor always softened the edges of her demanding days. Sarah, a black woman in her late 30s, carried herself with an unshakable confidence that had been forged through years of relentless dedication. Her fit frame and meticulously pressed uniform spoke of discipline, while her sharp, discerning eyes revealed a mind that missed nothing. She wasn't tall, but her presence filled any space she entered, a testament to her journey from a rookie cop to one of the most respected lieutenants in the district. Colleagues admired her leadership. The community trusted her resolve. When she walked into a room, heads turned, not just because she was a black woman in a role so often denied to people like her, but because her actions had earned her a reputation that demanded respect. As she pushed open the creaky glass door of the store, a faint bell jingled overhead. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the familiar scent of cleaning supplies and spiced snacks. She offered a tired but genuine smile to Mr. Singh, who stood behind the counter, his gray hair neatly combed, his apron slightly wrinkled from a long shift. "Afternoon, Lieutenant Thompson," he said, his voice warm and accented with the lilt of his native Punjab. "Good to see you again. Busy day, I suppose?" Sarah nodded, her lips curving upward. "Always is, Mr. Singh. Just popping in for a quick bite before I head back to the station." She moved toward the cooler, her boots clicking softly against the worn linoleum floor, and grabbed a chilled bottle of water. Then, from a nearby shelf, she picked up a granola bar, nothing fancy, just enough to quiet the growling in her stomach. As she turned toward the counter, a strange prickle ran up her spine. The air felt heavier than usual, charged with an unease she couldn't quite place. She chalked it up to exhaustion, the weight of a long day pressing against her temples. Or maybe the oppressive heat outside creeping through the walls. Shaking it off, she handed her items to Mr. Singh, who rang them up with his usual efficiency. But as she slipped her wallet back into her pocket and headed for the door, her instincts flared again. She felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her eyes darted to the far corner of the store, where a young white police officer stood, his posture rigid, his cold blue gaze fixed on her like a hawk tracking prey. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a lean build and a uniform that looked freshly pressed, as if he took pride in its sharpness. His name badge read, Jake Miller. A name that didn't ring any bells for Sarah. That alone was odd. She knew most of the officers in her district, their faces and quirks catalogued in her memory from years of working side by side. This one was a stranger, and the way he stared at her, unblinking, suspicious, set her nerves on edge. She frowned slightly but kept moving, brushing off the discomfort. She was a lieutenant. After all, a pillar of the force. What reason did she have to feel uneasy in a place she'd visited dozens of times? Yet as she reached the door, a voice sliced through the quiet like a shard of ice. "Excuse me, miss. I need to see your ID." The words stopped her cold. She turned slowly, her hand still resting on the doorframe, and faced Officer Miller. He stepped closer, his boots thudding deliberately against the floor, his right hand hovering near his holster in a gesture that felt more threatening than routine. Up close, his face was all hard lines, tight jaw, narrowed eyes, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sarah's initial unease morphed into irritation, a slow burn igniting in her chest. She straightened, her gaze locking onto his with the intensity of someone who'd faced down worse than this and come out on top. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "I don't understand why you're asking for my ID." She kept her tone professional, refusing to let the irritation bubbling inside her spill over. "Not yet." Miller didn't flinch. He closed the distance between them, leaving just a few feet of space, his posture radiating an arrogance that grated against her every nerve. "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store," he said. His voice clipped and accusatory. "I need to check your ID. Now." Sarah's mind reeled. Suspiciously? She'd walked in, grabbed a water and a granola bar, paid for them, and headed for the door. There was nothing suspicious about it, nothing at all. But she knew this script. She'd lived it too many times before, the sidelong glances, the unspoken assumptions. The weight of her skin color turning a mundane moment into a confrontation. Still, she held her ground, her sharp eyes boring into his. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, City Police Department," she said, each word deliberate, her authority unmistakable. "If you want to see my ID, you'll need a legitimate reason." Miller's smirk widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "Lieutenant." "Huh?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I saw you handling merchandise, looking like you were about to slip something under your jacket. I've asked for your ID. And you're going to show it to me. Right now." The accusation hit her like a slap. Stealing? Her? A woman who'd spent her life upholding the law. Who'd clawed her way up through a system stacked against her, now reduced to a petty thief in this man's eyes? Anger surged through her, hot and fierce, but she clamped it down. Years of discipline keeping her steady. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she fought to stay calm. "You're accusing me of stealing?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Her composure fraying at the edges. "I bought a bottle of water and a granola bar. I paid for them. If you think I did something wrong, you'll need more than vague suspicions." Miller's eyes darkened, his confidence hardening into aggression. "I've seen enough," he snapped. "This is your last chance to show me your ID before I arrest you." The word arrest hung in the air, absurd and surreal. Sarah's blood boiled, her hands itching to ball into fists, but she knew the stakes. She was a black woman in a uniform, facing a white officer with a chip on his shoulder. One wrong move, and this could spiral into something uglier than words. She stepped forward, closing the gap between them, her gaze unflinching. "I am Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, City Police Department," she repeated, her voice low and commanding. "I will not show you my ID unless you have a legal, legitimate reason to demand it." For a long moment, Miller stared at her, his face a mask of frustration and fury. No one challenged him like this, certainly not a black woman whose rank he didn't yet comprehend. His hand tightened on his holster, his knuckles widening as if he were itching to escalate. "Lieutenant, huh?" he sneered, sarcasm lacing every syllable. "Fine. We'll see who you really are once you're in handcuffs." Before Sarah could respond, he lunged forward, grabbing her arm with a force that sent a jolt of shock through her. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around her wrists, biting into her skin as he yanked her toward the door. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed down on a small crowd that had gathered, locals drawn by the commotion, their murmurs rising like a tide. "Shoplifter!" Miller barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Caught her red-handed. Sarah's face burned with humiliation, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she was powerless to stop this public spectacle. She saw the faces in the crowd, some confused, some judgmental, a few recognizing her and whispering in disbelief. Mr. Singh rushed out from behind the counter, his apron flapping as he waved his hands in protest. "No, no, officer. You've got it wrong," he shouted, his voice trembling with urgency. "She's Lieutenant Thompson. She paid for everything, I saw it myself." But Miller ignored him, shoving Sarah toward his patrol car with a roughness that made her stumble. The older man's pleas faded into the background as Sarah's mind raced, her pride warring with her professionalism. She wanted to scream, to demand respect, but she knew silence was her shield, for now. At the station, the air was thick with the hum of fluorescent lights and the chatter of officers. Miller marched Sarah through the bullpen, his chest puffed out like a conqueror. Oblivious to the stunned looks from her colleagues. Faces turned, eyes widened, some in confusion, others in recognition. A veteran sergeant. A burly man named Tompkins who'd worked with Sarah for years, stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "What the hell's going on here?" he demanded, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise. Miller smirked, jerking his thumb at Sarah. "Caught this one shoplifting. Thought she could talk her way out of it." Tompkins stared, then let out a bark of incredulous laughter. "Shoplifting? That's Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, you idiot. One of the best damn officers in this district." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Miller's smirk faltered. His eyes darting from Tompkins to Sarah, realization creeping into his expression like a slow poison. Sarah straightened, the handcuffs still biting into her wrists, but her dignity intact. "Take these off," she said quietly, her voice a blade wrapped in calm. "Now." Miller hesitated, his bravado crumbling, then fumbled with the keys, releasing her with shaky hands. The room buzzed with whispers as he stepped back, his face paling. For Mitchell, the man who'd once stood untouchable atop a tower of lies, justice had come differently. He'd been a cop too, a high-ranking one, until his corruption unraveled, dragging him into a cell where the real punishment wasn't the bars or the lost career. It was the mirror he couldn't escape. The reflection of a life built on deceit. Every night, as the cell door clanged shut, he wrestled with the truth, his power, his reputation, his identity, all ashes now. He'd had a choice once, to uphold the law or twist it, and he'd chosen wrong. Now, stripped of everything, he faced the deepest consequence, living with himself. Sarah's ordeal was shorter, sharper. But no less profound. As she rubbed her wrists, the sting of the cuffs fading, she felt the eyes of her peers, some sympathetic, some ashamed. Miller slunk away, his arrogance deflated. But the damage lingered. Justice, she thought, wasn't just his humiliation or the system correcting itself. It was the lesson etched into this moment: power misused would always meet its reckoning. For Mitchell, it was a slow burn of self-awareness, for Miller, a public fall. And for Sarah, it was the quiet strength of standing tall when the truth finally broke through. The crowd outside the station grew as word spread, Mr. Singh among them, his face etched with worry and indignation. "I told him," he muttered to anyone who'd listen. "I told him she was good. Honest." His loyalty warmed Sarah, a small balm against the day's wounds. Justice wasn't just the fall of the corrupt, it was the ripple of truth through those they touched, a reminder that no one, no matter how untouchable they seemed, could outrun it forever. The sharp metallic clink of handcuffs rattled through the air as Officer Jake Miller pulled them from his belt. His movements deliberate and heavy with authority. He took a slow, menacing step forward, his boots thudding against the linoleum floor of the small convenience store. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he barked, his voice icy and commanding, laced with a tone that brooked no argument. "You're under arrest for suspicion of shoplifting." The words hit Sarah Thompson like a physical blow, stopping her breath in her chest as the world around her seemed to freeze. For a fleeting second, she stood rooted to the spot. Her heart hammering against her ribs, disbelief swirling in her mind like a storm. Shoplifting? The accusation was so absurd, so far removed from anything she'd ever dreamed could touch her life, that it felt like a cruel joke. But the cold gleam in Miller's eyes told her this was no jest, it was a deliberate assault, a grotesque misuse of the power he wielded. And deep down, in the pit of her stomach, Sarah knew why. She was a black woman, and to him, that alone was enough. Time stretched thin as she processed the moment, her thoughts racing in a chaotic tangle of outrage and fear. Around her, the store buzzed with the weight of curious onlookers, customers clutching their baskets, their eyes darting toward her with a mix of fascination and unease. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, pressing down on her shoulders as Miller's gaze bore into her, his arrogance practically radiating off him. Sarah's blood boiled, a fiery rage surging through her veins, urging her to lash out, to scream at the injustice of it all. But beneath that anger, a colder, sharper instinct whispered caution. She wasn't just any woman standing in this store, she was Lieutenant Sarah Thompson of the City Police Department, a veteran who'd spent years upholding the law. She knew how quickly a situation like this could spiral into something dangerous, especially with a man like Miller, whose smug expression hinted at a thirst for confrontation. Swallowing her fury, she forced herself to think strategically. This wasn't just about her pride, it was about survival. About keeping this volatile encounter from erupting into violence. With the weight of every stare pressing against her, Sarah drew in a deep, steadying breath, the sound of it loud in her own ears. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around, her movements measured as she raised her hands and placed them behind her head, just as Miller had ordered. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a fight, not yet. The cold snap of the handcuffs locking around her wrists sent a shiver down her spine, the steel biting into her skin with an unforgiving grip. She'd handled those cuffs countless times in her career, slipping them onto the wrists of suspects with a calm professionalism she'd honed over years. Never once had she imagined they'd encircle her own wrists, branding her with the same shame she'd seen in the eyes of those she'd arrested. A wave of humiliation crashed over her, hot and suffocating. Not just from Miller's actions but from the sheer lunacy of the scene unfolding around her. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a low hum of disbelief and speculation rippling through the store as shoppers craned their necks to watch. To them, she was a spectacle, a puzzle they couldn't quite piece together. Miller's hand clamped down on her arm, his grip rough and unyielding as he shoved her toward the store's glass doors. The handcuffs dug deeper into her flesh with each step, the physical sting a faint echo compared to the searing humiliation that clawed at her insides. She, a lieutenant who'd poured her life into safeguarding this community, was now being paraded like some petty thief, her dignity stripped away in front of strangers and neighbors alike. The store's atmosphere thickened, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows that danced across the faces of the onlookers. Sarah fought to hold herself together, her jaw clenched tight as she battled the emotional tempest raging within. "You're making a huge mistake, Officer Miller," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I'm not someone you can trample over with your badge. I told you, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Thompson of the City Police Department. I didn't steal anything." Her words hung in the air, sharp and defiant. But Miller didn't even flinch. A smirk curled his lips, his eyes glinting with a smug satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "You can talk all you want," he sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. "I saw how you were acting in here. You're coming with me to the station, and the law will sort you out." To Miller, this wasn't about justice, it was a game. A twisted flex of power he relished all the more because of who she was, a black woman in a uniform he clearly held in contempt. As they stepped outside, the harsh midday sun blasted down, its unrelenting heat amplifying the pressure crushing her spirit. Passers-by slowed their steps, their heads turning as they caught sight of her, a police officer in handcuffs. An anomaly that demanded attention. Some fumbled for their phones, their fingers eager to capture the moment, while others whispered to one another. their voices a rising tide of curiosity and confusion. Sarah straightened her spine, lifting her chin despite the weight dragging at her soul. She refused to let them, especially Miller, see her break. But inside, she felt like she was crumbling, each step toward the patrol car a march toward a humiliation she'd never anticipated. Miller yanked open the back door of the cruiser parked haphazardly along the curb, his movements rough as he pushed her inside. The door slammed shut with a resounding bang, locking her into a space that felt like a cage. Sarah settled onto the worn vinyl seat, the air inside stifling as sunlight streamed through the windows, turning the car into a sweltering oven. She glanced out and saw Miller standing just beyond the glass, radio in hand, his posture brimming with self-assured swagger. "This is Officer Jake Miller, badge number 4396. He announced into the receiver, his voice crackling over the airwaves with a glee that made her stomach churn. "I've just arrested a suspect, female, black, mid-30s. Name's Lieutenant Sarah Thompson of the City Police Department. Reason, suspected shoplifting." Each word was a dagger, slicing through the life she'd built, reducing her years of service to a humiliating soundbite. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd fought for, teetered on the edge of ruin, and all she could do was sit there, powerless. As the radio broadcaster shamed to anyone listening. When Miller slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, Sarah turned her gaze to the window, watching the familiar streets roll by. These were the roads she'd patrolled for years, the corners where she'd mediated disputes, the intersections where she'd stood watch during late-night shifts. Every inch of this city held pieces of her dedication, her sacrifices, her pride. Now, she was a prisoner in the back of a patrol car. Stripped of that legacy by a man who saw her not as a colleague, but as a target. The car pulled into the station's parking lot, and her pulse quickened, thudding in her ears as the reality of what awaited her sank in. She'd walked through those doors 1,000 times, a respected figure among her peers. Today, she'd enter as a suspect. Her honor dragged through the mud. Miller killed the engine and hauled her out with a roughness that nearly toppled her. She stumbled, then steadied herself, her eyes blazing with a quiet fury as she met his gaze. She said nothing, words felt useless now, but her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about reclaiming the dignity he'd tried to steal. Inside the station, the air shifted, growing heavy with the weight of stunned silence. Officers paused mid-conversation, their pens hovering over paperwork as they turned to stare. Staff members peeked over cubicles, their faces a mix of shock, confusion, and something darker, judgment. Sarah felt their eyes like pinpricks, each one a reminder of how quickly perception could shift. To them, she was no longer Lieutenant Thompson, the steadfast leader, she was a figure in handcuffs. A question mark. Miller marched her through the lobby, his stride brimming with arrogance as he ignored the murmurs rippling around them. He stopped at Officer Reynolds' desk, slamming a stack of papers down with a force that echoed through the room. "Got a suspect to process," he said coldly. "Suspected shoplifting." Reynolds, a wiry man with tired eyes and a decade on the force, looked up, and froze. Recognition flashed across his face, his brows knitting together in disbelief. "Lieutenant Thompson?" he asked, his voice a mix of shock and concern. "What's going on? You were arrested for shoplifting?" Sarah met his gaze, her chest tightening as she saw the confusion in his eyes. She wanted to explain, to unravel the truth right there, but the weight of the moment silenced her. The facts were clear, she'd done nothing wrong, but the image before them, the cuffs, the escort, spoke louder than any defense she could muster. As she stood there, the station buzzing with whispers and sidelong glances, Sarah felt the sting of a deeper lesson: justice wasn't always blind. And power, when abused, could twist even the strongest foundations. Miller's actions weren't just a personal attack, they were a warning. A reminder of how fragile trust could be in a system where authority could so easily become a weapon. Yet amid the doubt and the stares, Sarah's resolve grew. She'd fight, not just for her innocence, but for the principle that no one, not even a man like Miller, could wield power unchecked. The truth would surface, she told herself, and when it did, it would shine a light on the consequences of his arrogance, a reckoning he couldn't escape. In the dim, flickering light of the police station, the air felt heavy with tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sarah Thompson, a formidable black woman whose presence commanded respect, stood with her shoulders squared, though her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. This wasn't just another day at work, it was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. For years, she had walked these halls as a lieutenant. Her dedication to justice unwavering, her integrity a shield against the chaos of the world she policed. Now, that shield had been stripped away, replaced by the cold weight of handcuffs and the sting of betrayal. Officer Miller, the man behind this twisted ordeal, wasn't simply doing his job. No. This was something darker, a deliberate flex of power, a chance to feed his ego by dragging her down. The smug curl of his lips as he stood nearby told her everything she needed to know. He relished this moment, savoring her humiliation like a predator toying with its prey. Across the room, Lieutenant Reynolds hunched over the desk, his brow furrowed and his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled the paperwork Miller had carelessly tossed his way. Reynolds was a man of routine, a steady cog in the station's machinery. But today that routine felt like a betrayal of its own. He had known Sarah for years, long enough to see her tireless work ethic, her unyielding moral compass. The accusation of shoplifting clinging to her name was absurd, a jagged piece that didn't fit the puzzle of who she was. "Is this for real?" he muttered, his voice low and laced with worry as he glanced up at her. His hazel eyes, usually calm, flickered with unease. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it. But the weight of procedure pressed down on him like a vice. "Can you explain what's going on, Sarah?" His tone wasn't accusing, it was pleading. As if he hoped her words could unravel this mess before it spiraled further. Sarah met his gaze, her dark eyes steady despite the storm raging inside her. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain even, though every syllable felt like it was clawing its way out. "I didn't steal anything, Reynolds," she said, each word deliberate, a lifeline to her dignity. "This is a blatant abuse of power by Officer Miller. I've been set up." Her chest tightened as she spoke, the shame and fury warring within her. She could still feel the eyes of the convenience store clerk on her as she'd paid for her bottle of water and granola bar, such mundane items, now twisted into a weapon against her. Turning slightly, she caught Miller's silhouette in her peripheral vision. He stood there, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his posture radiating arrogance. That smug smile hadn't left his face. And it gnawed at her, a silent taunt daring her to break. Miller stepped forward, his boots thudding against the tiled floor with a rhythm that echoed his confidence. "She was arrested as she was about to leave the convenience store," he said, his voice icy and sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "I saw her suspicious behavior with the merchandise myself." There was no hesitation in his words, no crack of doubt, just a cold disdain that dripped from every syllable. He didn't flinch under Reynolds' incredulous stare. Didn't soften at the absurdity of his claim. To Miller, this wasn't about truth, it was about control. Sarah's years of authority, her strength as a black woman in a position of power, threatened him in ways he'd never admit aloud. This arrest was his retaliation, a chance to remind her, and everyone watching, that he could bend the rules to his will. Reynolds shook his head, the motion slow and heavy, as if trying to dislodge the disbelief clinging to his thoughts. He sighed, the sound ragged with exhaustion, and reached for the fingerprinting kit on the desk. His fingers hesitated over the equipment, the weariness etching deeper lines into his face. "All right," he said reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll have to go through the procedure. I'll need to fingerprint you and take your picture, Lieutenant." He paused, meeting her eyes again, his expression apologetic. "I really don't want to do this, but we need to follow the rules." The words hung between them, fragile and strained. He wasn't the enemy here, Sarah knew that, but the system he served had no mercy for exceptions, not even for someone like her. Sarah nodded silently, her lips pressed into a thin line. She understood Reynolds' position, trapped as he was by protocol, but that didn't lessen the humiliation searing through her. The police station, once her domain, now felt like a cage closing in. As Reynolds pulled out the ink pad and paper, she closed her eyes for a moment, bracing herself. The cold touch of the ink against her fingertips sent a shiver up her spine, each press onto the white sheet a mark of disgrace she'd never imagined for herself. She had used this very process countless times to identify criminals, thieves, liars, threats to the public. Now, her own hands were stained, her identity reduced to a series of black smudges. The irony was bitter, a cruel twist that lodged in her throat. Miller watched it all unfold, his arms still crossed, his satisfaction palpable. Every click of the ink pad, every rustle of paper, was a victory to him, a testament to the power he wielded over her. He didn't need to say it, his presence screamed it loud enough. But Sarah refused to let him see her crumble. Beneath the hurt and the anger, a fire burned, steady and unyielding. This wasn't just a personal attack, it was a battle for her honor, a stand against the corruption he embodied. She lifted her chin slightly, her resolve hardening with every passing second. When the fingerprinting was done, Reynolds gestured toward the white wall where the mugshot camera waited, its lens glinting like an unblinking eye. "We need to take your picture, Lieutenant," he said softly, almost as if he were apologizing again. Sarah took a deep breath, the air sharp in her lungs, and stepped forward. She stood tall, her posture defiant even as her heart sank. The flash exploded in a blinding burst, freezing her in that moment of indignity. The image it captured wasn't just a photograph, it was a wound, a permanent scar of the injustice she faced. As the light faded, she turned back to Miller, who hadn't moved an inch. His lips twisted into a mocking grin. "Do you think you'll get out of this easily, Lieutenant?" he sneered, his voice thick with sarcasm. "You made a big mistake thinking you could stand above the law." Sarah's eyes locked onto his, the fury inside her blazing hot and fierce, but she kept her tone steady, cutting through his taunts like a blade. "This isn't about the law," she said, her words measured and firm. "This is about you abusing your power. And I won't let you win this dirty game." Miller's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly shrugged, turning away as if her defiance meant nothing. He thrived on her struggle, convinced he held all the cards. The paperwork complete, Reynolds slid the handcuffs back onto Sarah's wrists, his movements slow and reluctant. The metal bit into her skin as he led her down the hallway toward the holding cells. Each step echoed in the silence, a stark contrast to the days when she'd walked these corridors with authority. Now, they stabbed at her pride, each one a reminder of how far she'd fallen. The holding cell loomed ahead, its steel door swinging open with a groan. Inside, the air was stale, the bench hard and unforgiving. Reynolds hesitated as he guided her in, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet sorrow. "I'm sorry," he whispered, before the door clanged shut behind her. The lock clicked into place, a sound so final it seemed to reverberate through her bones. Alone in the dim cell, Sarah sank onto the bench, her body sagging as the adrenaline drained away. The isolation pressed down on her, thick and suffocating, but her mind refused to rest. How had it come to this? A lieutenant with a spotless record, now locked up on fabricated charges? The absurdity of it gnawed at her, but beneath the shock lay a deeper truth: this was no accident. Miller's actions reeked of prejudice, of a need to punish her for daring to rise as a black woman in a world that often resented her strength. Yet even as despair threatened to take root, Sarah's spirit fought back. She wouldn't let this define her. The truth would surface, she'd make sure of it. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, sharp and purposeful against the concrete floor. The cell door creaked open, and Captain Rebecca Davis stepped inside, her presence filling the cramped space. Davis was a force of nature, stern, fair, and unyielding, with a reputation for cutting through corruption like a scythe. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, her uniform crisp, but her eyes softened with concern as they landed on Sarah. "What is going on here, Thompson?" she demanded, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "I heard you were arrested for shoplifting." The word sounded foreign coming from her, as if she couldn't reconcile it with the woman standing before her. Sarah rose to her feet, relief flooding her chest at the sight of her mentor. If anyone could right this wrong, it was Davis. Still, the humiliation of explaining it aloud stung like salt in a wound. "It's a setup, Captain," she said, her voice calm but threaded with steel. "Officer Miller abused his power and arrested me on baseless accusations. He claims I stole something from a convenience store, when all I did was buy a bottle of water and a granola bar. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's racism and authority twisted into a weapon against me." Her hands clenched at her sides, the memory of Miller's sneer fueling her resolve. Davis didn't reply immediately. She studied Sarah, her sharp gaze dissecting every word, every flicker of emotion. Known for her zero-tolerance stance on wrongdoing, she was no stranger to the flaws in the system she served. After a long pause, she turned to Reynolds, who lingered awkwardly by the door, clutching the paperwork like a shield. "Release her immediately," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the stack in his hands. "Captain, I understand. But procedure is procedure. I have to process her according to the rules." Davis's expression didn't waver, her resolve a wall of iron. "I don't care about procedure right now," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "Release her. If there's any fallout, I'll take full responsibility." Her words carried the weight of her rank, and Reynolds, though hesitant, couldn't defy her. He fumbled with the keys, unlocking the door and slipping the handcuffs off Sarah's wrists. The metal fell away, and she rubbed her skin, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. Freedom returned. But it was only the beginning. Davis gave her a sharp nod. "Come with me," she said, turning on her heel and striding out of the cell. Sarah followed, her step steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside her: anger, relief, determination. As they emerged into the main station, the air grew thick with the stares of her colleagues. Faces she knew well, some wide-eyed with shock, others clouded with confusion, watched her pass. Whispers rippled through the room, but Sarah kept her head high, her gaze fixed ahead. She wouldn't let their judgment touch her. This ordeal had stripped her bare, exposed her to the raw edges of injustice, but it had also laid bare a deeper lesson: power, unchecked, could corrupt even the systems meant to protect. Miller's actions weren't just a personal vendetta, they were a warning of what happened, and authority became a tool for oppression rather than justice. Yet Sarah's fight was far from over. With Davis by her side, she'd claw her way back, not just to clear her name, but to hold a mirror to the consequences of such abuse. The law she'd sworn to uphold demanded nothing less. With every step she took, Sarah carried the unshakable confidence she'd forged through years of tireless service as a police officer. Her boots clicked against the polished floor, a steady rhythm that echoed her resolve. She'd spent countless hours upholding the law, facing down chaos and danger. And that experience had built a steel core within her. Yet, as she walked toward Captain Davis's office, she couldn't shake the weight of the suspicious glances that had followed her lately. She knew deep down that no amount of heartfelt explanations or even the unvarnished truth could instantly wipe away those doubting stares. They lingered like shadows, staining the honor she'd worked so hard to earn. But Sarah wasn't the type to crumble under scrutiny. She was determined to claw her way back to the respect she deserved, no matter what it took. The door to Captain Davis's office creaked open, revealing a modest space that felt both familiar and suffocatingly tense. The room was small, its walls lined with neatly arranged files and a few faded commendations framed in simple black frames. A single window let in a sliver of gray morning light, casting faint streaks across the hardwood desk where Davis sat. This wasn't Sarah's first time here. She'd spent hours in this very chair, discussing cases, strategies, and the weight of their shared duty. Today, though, the air felt heavier, charged with unspoken stakes. Davis gestured toward the seat across from her, her movements deliberate but not unkind. Sarah settled into the chair, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she braced herself for what was coming. "Sarah," Davis began, her voice softer than usual but laced with a gravity that made Sarah's stomach tighten, "I've worked with you for years. I've seen you in action. And I know you're one of the finest officers I've ever had under my command." She paused, her sharp brown eyes locking onto Sarah's, searching for something, perhaps a flicker of doubt or weakness. Finding none, she pressed on. "But there's something rotten about this case. Officer Miller, he's shown troubling signs before. This isn't the first time his name has come up tied to whispers of overreach, of bending the rules to suit himself. I believe you, but belief alone won't cut it. If we're going to unravel this mess and set things right, we need hard, undeniable evidence." Sarah nodded, her jaw clenched as she absorbed Davis's words. The captain was right, as she so often was. What had happened wasn't just a petty squabble or a fleeting misuse of authority, it was a calculated strike aimed straight at Sarah's heart, meant to shred her reputation and leave her broken. The sting of it burned deep, a mix of anger and betrayal swirling in her chest. "I know, Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "I'm certain the security footage from the store will show what really happened. If we can get our hands on the original, untainted version, it'll prove I'm innocent. It has to." Davis leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk as she considered Sarah's words. The faint tapping filled the silence, a small sign of the captain's own restless thoughts. After a moment, she nodded decisively. "I'll take care of it myself. I'll request the footage from the store and start an official investigation into this whole fiasco. But Sarah," she added, her tone sharpening, "you need to steel yourself. If Miller's behind this, and I suspect he is, he's not the kind to give up without a fight. He's cunning, and if he's gone this far to sabotage you, he's likely covered his tracks with precision." Sarah let out a slow, heavy sigh, the weight of the truth settling over her like a damp fog. She'd seen it too many times in her career, people with power twisting it to shield their sins, burying their misdeeds under layers of lies and intimidation. Miller wasn't just a bad apple. He was a predator in uniform, and she'd underestimated him. "I won't let him win, Captain," she said, her voice rising with a fierce edge. "I've poured my life into this job, into justice, into doing what's right. I'll fight with everything I've got to clear my name." Her words weren't just a promise, they were a vow, etched into her very being. Captain Davis met her gaze. And for a fleeting moment, a flicker of empathy softened the older woman's stern features. But the seriousness quickly returned, her expression hardening. "I'm with you, Sarah. I believe in you. But we've got to tread carefully. This isn't just about your honor, it's about the integrity of the system we've both sworn to protect. If Miller's corruption runs as deep as I fear, this could shake everything." Sarah felt a wave of relief crash over her, soothing the raw edges of her nerves. She wasn't alone in this. Davis, with her quiet strength and unyielding sense of duty, was a rock she could lean on. Together, they'd dig up the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. But even as gratitude warmed her, Sarah knew the war was far from won. Miller was a dangerous man, slippery, ruthless, and fueled by an arrogance that made him believe he was untouchable. Her resolve hardened further, a fire igniting in her gut. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been crushed under the weight of unchecked power. Every soul who'd tasted injustice because someone like Miller thought the rules didn't apply to them. She'd fight for them all. And she wouldn't rest until she'd taken back everything he'd tried to steal from her, her name, her pride, her place in the world. Leaving Davis's office, Sarah felt a renewed surge of determination pulsing through her veins. The hallway stretched out before her, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, casting stark shadows on the linoleum floor. She knew the path ahead would be treacherous, littered with obstacles Miller had no doubt planted to trip her up. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. It had swelled into a crusade for justice, a battle to prove that the system could still hold its own against those who sought to corrupt it. Davis's support was a lifeline, but without solid proof, their hands were tied. Evidence was the key, and Sarah wouldn't stop until she had it. As she stepped into the cool morning air outside the station, Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed Jason Walker, her partner and one of the few people she trusted implicitly. Jason was more than a colleague, he was a brother in arms, a wiry man with a quick wit and a loyalty that ran bone deep. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice crackled through the line, tinged with worry. "Sarah, what's going on? I've been hearing rumors, and none of them sound good." "Jason, I need you," she said, her tone calm but threaded with an urgency she couldn't hide. "I've been framed. Arrested for a theft I didn't commit. Miller's behind it, he's pinned me for stealing from that convenience store on Elm Street. I'm sure the security footage will clear me. But I need help getting the original before he buries it." She could almost hear the gears turning in Jason's mind as he processed her words, his silence heavy with disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" He finally burst out, his voice rising with indignation. "Miller? That slimy bastard's always had a reputation for throwing his weight around, but this? Going after you, a lieutenant. One of the best damn cops on the force. That's insane. I knew he was dirty, but I never thought he'd stoop this low." His anger mirrored her own, a shared fury that strengthened her resolve. "He's crossed a line, Jason," she replied, her words clipped and firm. "And I'm not letting him get away with it. But I can't do this alone. We need that footage, the real footage. Not whatever doctored version he might have cooked up. It's my only shot." Jason let out a long, weary sigh, the sound crackling through the phone. She could picture him running a hand through his messy brown hair, his brow furrowed as he weighed the stakes. "All right," he said at last, his tone shifting to one of steely determination. "I'll dig into this. I'll find out who reported the theft, track down that footage, and if Miller's tampered with anything, I'll sniff it out. We'll nail him, Sarah. I promise." Relief flooded her. A small but vital lifeline in the chaos. "Thank you, Jason. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Don't mention it," he shot back, a hint of his usual cockiness creeping in. "We'll figure this out. I'll call you the second I've got something." The line went dead, and Sarah pocketed her phone, her mind racing. Miller hadn't done this on a whim, he'd planned it. Every detail meticulously arranged to trap her. If he'd gone to such lengths, he'd be ready to destroy any evidence that could expose him. She had to move fast. A sudden thought struck her. Sharp and insistent. The convenience store had cameras, multiple angles, if she remembered right. If Miller had altered the footage, someone had to have helped him, or at least witnessed it. Her mind flashed to the store clerk, Mr. Patel, a wiry man with nervous hands and a tendency to avoid eye contact. That day, when Miller had stormed in and pointed the finger at her. Patel had seemed jittery, his voice trembling as he backed up the accusation. Was he scared? Coerced? Or had he been a willing pawn in Miller's game? Either way, he knew something. And Sarah needed answers. The next morning, she and Jason headed to the store, the site of her humiliation. The bell above the door jangled as they stepped inside. The sound grating against Sarah's frayed nerves. The place looked unchanged, rows of shelves stocked with chips and candy, a flickering neon sign in the window buzzing faintly. But to Sarah, it felt alien now, tainted by the memory of Miller's smug grin as he'd slapped the cuffs on her wrists. Shame and rage churned in her gut, threatening to overwhelm her, but she shoved them down. She had a job to do. Mr. Patel stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag that looked more dirty than clean. When he glanced up and saw Sarah, his eyes widened. And the rag slipped from his grip. Hello, officer," he stammered, his accent thick with unease. What can I do for you?" Sarah kept her voice even, though her piercing gaze pinned him in place. "Mr. Patel, we need to talk about what happened the other day. I think you know more than you've let on." He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbing as beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. I told the police everything already," he said, his words tumbling out too fast. "I don't know anything else. I was just following orders." "Orders from who?" Jason cut in, stepping forward with a sharpness that made Patel flinch. Sarah held up a hand to ease the tension, but her stare never wavered. "Mr. Patel, something's wrong with this case, and I think you're caught in the middle of it. This is your chance to come clean, before it gets worse for you." Patel's shoulders slumped, his resolve crumbling under the weight of their scrutiny. It was Officer Miller, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He came here a few days ago. Told me to report a theft, said it was you. I didn't want to, but he threatened me. Said I'd lose my store, my family's livelihood, if I didn't go along. I had no choice." His eyes darted between them, pleading for understanding. Sarah's blood boiled, but she kept her composure, channeling her fury into focus. Miller hadn't just framed her, he'd bullied an innocent man into his scheme, wielding his badge like a weapon. "We need your help, Mr. Patel," she said firmly. "An official statement about what Miller did. If you tell the truth, we can protect you." Jason nodded, his tone softening slightly. "Do the right thing here. And we'll make sure you're not the one who pays for his mess." Patel hesitated, then gave a shaky nod. "Okay. I'll do it. I just want this over with." As they left the store, Sarah felt a flicker of hope pierce the gloom. Patel's testimony was a crack in Miller's armor, but they still needed that footage to shatter it completely. Jason clapped her on the shoulder, his grin fierce. "We're getting there. I'll keep digging, see if anyone else saw Miller pulling strings." She managed a small smile, grateful for his unshakable support. Back at the station, her phone buzzed with a message from Davis, footage retrieved. "Meet me now." Her heart leapt into her throat, a dizzying mix of anticipation and dread. This could be it, the proof she'd been chasing. But a nagging fear gnawed at her. Miller was too smart to let it all slip away so easily. What if he'd tampered with it? What if he'd outmaneuvered them again? She and Jason raced back, the station's sterile halls closing in around them as they approached Davis's office. The air crackled with tension. Every sound amplified, the hum of the lights, the distant clatter of a keyboard, the thud of her own heartbeat. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about justice, raw, unflinching justice, and the bitter consequences of power run amok. Miller had abused his authority, trampling over lives to protect his ego, and Sarah wouldn't let him escape the reckoning. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it head-on, armed with the truth and the will to see it through. The door to Captain Davis's office hung slightly open. A narrow sliver of light spilling into the dimly lit hallway beyond. Inside, Captain Davis sat behind her desk, her posture rigid yet composed, her face a mask of stoic resolve. Only her eyes betrayed the storm brewing within, sharp, piercing, and unyielding. They locked onto the world with a seriousness that could cut through steel. On the polished surface of her desk sat a laptop, its screen dark but humming faintly with the promise of truth, or betrayal. Sarah felt her chest tighten the moment she stepped into the room. Her gaze drawn irresistibly to that machine. It held the security footage, the fragile thread upon which her entire future dangled. "Take a seat, Sarah," Captain Davis said. Her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of gravity. She gestured toward the two chairs opposite her, her hand moving with deliberate calm. Jason, ever the professional, settled into his seat with a quiet confidence, his jaw set and his demeanor unshaken. But Sarah's breath caught in her throat, shallow and uneven, as she lowered herself into the chair. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Davis inhaled deeply. Her stern gaze softening for just a fleeting moment as it settled on Sarah, a flicker of empathy amid the steel. "I've reviewed the footage," she began, her tone low and weighted with meaning. "But we've got a serious problem. The most critical part, the part that matters most, has been tampered with." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her heart constricted. A sharp pang of dread twisting through her. "Tampered with," she echoed, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "How could that even happen?" "That footage, it's my only chance to prove I didn't do this." Her mind raced, replaying every moment of the accusations leveled against her. The weight of suspicion that had crushed her spirit for weeks. Davis nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line as frustration flickered in her eyes. "I know," she said softly. "And that's exactly why we can't waste a second. I'm almost certain Miller's behind this. The footage shows you in the store, clear as day, but the part where they claim you stole? It's gone, cut out like it never existed. We need to track down the original before he wipes it for good." Jason, who had been listening in tense silence, finally leaned forward. His voice taut with urgency. "If Miller tampered with it, he's still got the unedited version somewhere. We're on borrowed time here, if we don't move now. He'll destroy every shred of evidence and bury this." His words ignited a spark of fury in Sarah's chest. Miller, a man she'd once respected, now a venomous shadow slithering through her life. Determined to shred her career and tarnish her honor. He'd nearly succeeded, too. "We can't let him get away with this," she said. Her voice rising with a fierce determination that surprised even herself. "We have to find that footage before it's too late." Davis gave a curt nod, her eyes gleaming with resolve. "I've already ordered an official investigation into Miller's actions, but we can't wait for bureaucracy to catch up. You too, Jason, Sarah, you need to figure out where he's stashed the original. If we recover it, this nightmare ends." The room buzzed with the weight of their shared mission, a fragile plan forming in the charged silence. But before they could solidify their next step, the door burst open with a violent thud, shattering the stillness. Miller stormed in, his broad frame filling the doorway, his face a twisted mask of fury and defiance. His eyes, dark and simmering with resentment, darted around the room, dismissing everyone but locking onto Davis with a venomous glare. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, his voice raw with rage. "Why am I hearing whispers that you're investigating me?" His presence sucked the air from the room, his arrogance a palpable force pressing against them all. Captain Davis rose to her feet. Unruffled, her calm authority a stark contrast to Miller's bluster. "We're looking into your actions, Miller," she said evenly, her voice cutting through his tantrum like a blade. "There's evidence you've been abusing your power, tampering with footage in Lieutenant Thompson's case." Miller let out a harsh, mocking laugh, his smug grin unfaltering. "This is a joke, right? Thompson was caught red-handed, sticky fingers all over that store, and now you're spinning this around to pin it on me? What are you playing at?" His words dripped with condescension. Each syllable a calculated jab meant to wound. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She shot to her feet, her fear evaporating in the heat of her anger, and met Miller's gaze head-on. "You set this up," she said, her voice steady and cold. "You forced Mr. Paddle to lie, twisted his arm until he filed that fake report, and then you butchered the footage to bury the truth. You're trying to ruin me. But I won't let you win." Her heart pounded, but not with fear, now it was fueled by a righteous fury, a refusal to bow to his corruption. Miller took a step closer, his face hardening into a sneer. "You think you can take me down, Thompson? You've got nothing, no evidence, no proof. Your career's already toast. Give it up." Jason was on his feet now too, his restraint snapping like a taut wire. "We'll find the evidence, Miller," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That footage you messed with? It's not going to stay buried. If you think you can slither out of this, you're dead wrong." Miller's eyes narrowed, a shadow of unease flickering across his features before his bravado surged back. "You're all delusional," he spat. "I've been in this game long enough to know how to cover my tracks. Go ahead, try me." But Davis stepped forward, her presence a quiet storm of authority. "I've launched a full investigation into you, Miller," she said, her tone unshakable. "If you've got anything to say, save it for when the truth comes out. I won't let you, or anyone, poison this system with your corruption." Miller huffed, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. He took a step back, his glare sweeping over them all. "You're going to regret this," he snarled, his voice thick with menace. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him with a reverberating crash. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of his exit. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears, her hands trembling not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jason turned to her, his eyes blazing with determination. "We've got to find that original footage. If we don't, Miller will twist this whole thing around and bury us with it." Davis nodded, her jaw tight. "He's probably already moved it, hidden it somewhere he thinks we'll never look. We need to figure out where." Sarah's mind churned, sifting through memories of past cases, her instincts kicking into overdrive. "If Miller's hiding it, he won't keep it anywhere obvious," she said, her voice growing steadier. "But he'd want it close, somewhere he controls completely." Jason's brow furrowed, a spark of realization lighting his eyes. His house in the suburbs. It's isolated, he could stash it there without anyone noticing. Davis considered this, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against her desk. "That's a solid lead. We'll check it out. But we've got to move fast, Miller won't sit on that evidence long." In a heartbeat, a plan crystallized. Jason and Sarah would infiltrate Miller's house to recover the footage, while Davis worked behind the scenes to keep Miller distracted. The stakes were sky-high, this was their last shot to expose him, to drag his corruption into the light. As Sarah and Jason left the station, the night air bit at their skin, the tension between them palpable. They both knew failure wasn't an option. In the car, speeding toward Miller's suburban hideaway, Sarah felt every tick of the clock like a hammer against her ribs. If they didn't find that footage, her honor, her very identity, would be lost forever. And Miller's unchecked power would only grow. The house loomed ahead, a modern two-story structure nestled in the quiet sprawl of the suburbs. Darkness had begun to cloak the world, the fading light casting long shadows that danced across its pristine exterior. To any passerby, it was a picture of suburban serenity, neatly trimmed hedges, a sleek black car in the driveway, windows glowing faintly with warm light. But Sarah saw through the facade. Beneath its calm surface festered a conspiracy, a web of lies spun to protect Miller's crimes. "You ready?" she whispered to Jason as they crouched in the shadows near the back of the property, her hand tightening around the grip of her gun. Jason nodded, his eyes glinting with a fierce resolve. They'd faced countless trials together over the years, but this was a beast of its own, a mission that could unravel everything. "We'll go in through the back," Jason murmured, his voice barely audible. "I scoped it out earlier, no cameras there." He led the way, his movements swift and silent, a predator stalking through the night. Sarah followed, her senses razor-sharp. Every rustle of leaves or distant car engine setting her nerves alight. At the rear door, Jason knelt, pulling a small toolkit from his jacket. His fingers moved with practiced precision, teasing the lock until it gave way with a soft click. Sarah stood watch, her eyes darting across the yard, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it, their one chance to reclaim the truth. The door swung open, and they slipped inside, the house swallowing them in its eerie stillness. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if it held the secrets of Miller's deceit in every corner. They crept through the kitchen, past a sink piled with unwashed dishes, a rare glimpse of chaos in Miller's otherwise controlled life, and up the stairs toward his private office. Sarah's heart thudded against her ribs, each step amplifying the stakes. The office lay at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar, a faint sliver of moonlight spilling through the large window overlooking the backyard. Jason held up a hand, signaling her to wait, then edged forward to peer inside. "Clear," he whispered, and they stepped into the room. The space was a mess, papers strewn across the floor, files spilling from open drawers, a testament to Miller's frantic attempts to cover his tracks. Sarah's pulse quickened, the disorder felt like a sign they were close. Jason began rifling through cabinets, his movements swift but meticulous, while Sarah turned to the desk, her fingers brushing over its cluttered surface. Every second stretched into eternity, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of paper and their shallow breaths. Then Jason froze, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Got it," he said, holding up a small, unmarked USB drive. Sarah's breath hitched. It was the key, the untainted footage that could shatter Miller's lies. But before they could savor the victory, a deafening crash erupted from the front of the house. Sarah's heart lurched into her throat. Heavy footsteps thundered through the halls, each one laced with fury. Miller was home, earlier than they'd anticipated. "Hurry," she hissed, shoving the USB into her pocket as panic clawed at her. The truth was in their hands, but so was the danger, and it was closing in fast. This retelling amplifies the emotional depth of Sarah's desperation, Davis's quiet strength, Jason's loyalty, and Miller's menacing arrogance, while painting vivid scenes of tension and action. It underscores the broader lesson: justice demands relentless pursuit, and the abuse of power, no matter how cleverly concealed, leaves cracks that the determined can exploit. Miller's downfall isn't just a personal triumph for Sarah, it's a warning that corruption, unchecked, festers until it's forcibly uprooted. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. her wide eyes darting toward the office door as the heavy thud of Miller's boots echoed closer. The realization hit her like a freight train, there was no time left to hesitate. Beside her, Jason fumbled with the USB drive, his fingers trembling slightly as he shoved it deep into his pocket. The air in the room felt thick with tension. The faint hum of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead amplifying their racing pulses. They exchanged a fleeting, panicked glance before scrambling to find cover. Sarah pressed her back against the cold, shadowed corner of the room, her shallow breaths barely escaping her lips. Her hand clutched her gun so tightly her knuckles whitened. The cool metal a stark contrast to the heat rising in her chest. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash, wood splintering as Miller stormed in, his gun already drawn. His face was a twisted mask of fury, eyes blazing with a wild, unhinged intensity that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The office, once a place of order, now lay in chaos, papers strewn across the floor, a chair overturned in their haste. Miller's gaze swept the room, his nostrils flaring as he took in the disarray. "Come out now," he bellowed. His voice a thunderclap of rage and madness that reverberated off the walls. "I know you're in here." Sarah's stomach churned. This was it, the moment where everything would either collapse or ignite. She locked eyes with Jason again, his jaw tight, his nod subtle but resolute. With a shared breath, they sprang from their hiding spots, guns leveled at Miller in unison. "Freeze, Miller. Drop the gun, now." Sarah's command sliced through the air, sharp and unwavering, though inside, her nerves buzzed like a live wire. Miller whipped around, his eyes flashing with a feral, untamed wrath. "You think you can take me down?" he snarled, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you'll walk away from this? No one's going to believe you. I'll make you wish you'd never crossed me." His words dripped with venom, each syllable a promise of retribution. Sarah's grip on her weapon tightened, her steady gaze never leaving his. "It's over, Miller," she said, her voice cutting through his tirade like a blade. "I've got the unedited footage. You're done. You'll answer for every single thing you've done." Miller's teeth ground together, his face contorting as fury boiled over. His eyes, wild and desperate, flickered with a dangerous glint. In a sudden, reckless move, he jerked his gun upward, but Jason was faster. A deafening shot rang out, the sound ricocheting off the walls as the bullet tore into Miller's leg. He crumpled to the floor with a guttural groan. His weapon spinning out of his hand and skidding across the polished wood, coming to rest near the desk. Pain twisted his features, but even as he clutched his bleeding leg, defiance burned in his glare. "You'll never win," he spat, his voice hoarse but venomous. "This system, it'll always protect me." Sarah stepped forward, towering over him. Her gun still trained on his writhing form. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, a taunt rooted in years of corruption he'd wielded like a shield. "The system you thought you could twist and bend to your will, it's crumbling, Miller," she said, her tone resolute, her eyes blazing with a fire born of justice long denied. "We're dragging the truth into the light, and no one, not even you, can stop it." Jason, his breath still ragged from the adrenaline, pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click as they snapped around Miller's wrists felt like a punctuation mark on his reign of terror. "You've lost," Jason said, his voice low but firm. "Now you'll face real justice, not the kind you've been hiding behind." Minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the tense silence as police flooded the scene. Officers swarmed the office, their boots scuffing the floor as they took in the sight of Miller, bloodied and cuffed, his arrogance finally shattered. Sarah and Jason handed him over, the USB drive, a small, unassuming key to his downfall, still safe in Jason's pocket. They'd done it. The evidence was secure, and now the world would see Miller for what he truly was. As the officers dragged him away, his curses fading into the distance, Sarah felt a flicker of relief, but it was tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about her honor. It was about the countless others he'd crushed under his heel. Days later, the footage was dissected under the harsh glare of scrutiny. Analysts pored over every frame, their findings undeniable. Miller had tampered with it all, weaving lies into the fabric of truth to protect himself. Sarah had fought tooth and nail for this moment, her courage a beacon that had finally pierced the darkness. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire. Miller arrested, charged with abuse of power, evidence tampering, and a litany of other crimes unearthed from his sordid past. The revelation shook the department to its core. Colleagues who'd turned a blind eye or whispered excuses for Miller's behavior found themselves ensnared in the widening net of accountability. For Sarah, standing in the aftermath felt like waking from a fevered dream. She sat in her office. The walls adorned with plaques and medals that once felt hollow under the shadow of Miller's corruption. Now, they gleamed with renewed meaning. The battle had been brutal, pitting her against a system she'd sworn to uphold, one that had festered with rot beneath its surface. But she'd emerged victorious. Her honor reclaimed not just for herself, but for every soul who'd suffered under Miller's tyranny. The public airing of the footage had shifted everything. People whispered her name with respect. Her colleagues looked at her with a mix of awe and gratitude, and the community she'd served for years began to see a glimmer of hope in the justice she'd fought for. Jason stepped into her office one morning, his easy smile cutting through the quiet. "I still can't believe it's over," he said, dropping into the chair across from her desk. His voice carried a warmth that steadied her, a reminder of the unwavering partner who'd stood by her side. "We went all in, fought to the bitter end, and now it's all out there." Sarah returned his smile, though her eyes held a steely determination. "It's not over, Jason," she said softly. "This was just one chapter. What we did, it wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who's ever been trampled by people like Miller. We've got to keep pushing, keep making sure justice doesn't bend to power." He nodded, his expression sobering as he leaned forward. "You're right. You showed us all what's possible, Sarah. That even when the odds are stacked against you, justice can still come out on top. I've got your back, always." His words were a quiet vow, a bond forged in the heat of their shared struggle. At that moment, the door swung open, and Captain Davis strode in. Her presence filled the room, her stern features softened by a rare pride that shone in her eyes as she looked at Sarah. "Thompson," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "What you've done, it's nothing short of extraordinary. This department, this city, we need people like you. People who'll fight for what's right, no matter the cost." Sarah rose, meeting Davis's gaze as they shook hands. The captain's grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the weight Sarah had carried. "Thank you, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I just did what I knew was right. After everything, I think we can start rebuilding trust, show people the system can work for them, not against them." Davis nodded, a faint smile breaking through her usual reserve. "You've proven that justice can hold, even when it's tested. We'll rebuild stronger because of you." As Davis left, Sarah drifted to the window, her eyes tracing the city sprawled below. The morning sun bathed the streets in gold, casting long shadows that seemed to retreat from the light. She'd protected this place for years, but never had the stakes felt so personal, so profound. Outside, a few colleagues passed by, offering nods of respect, gestures that once felt rare, now a testament to the shift she'd sparked. Her honor wasn't just restored, it was redefined. She returned to her desk, a renewed fire burning within her. The fight for justice would never end, but she was ready, stronger, surer. a symbol of resilience and truth. Miller's downfall was a stark lesson: power, when abused, breeds its own destruction. Sarah had toppled a giant, exposing the fragility of a corrupt system that had shielded him for too long. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, one she'd wielded with unrelenting resolve. And as she stepped into the next chapter of her journey, she carried that lesson forward, determined to ensure no one else suffered under the weight of unchecked authority. The city glowed with possibility, and Sarah Thompson stood tall, ready to face whatever came next in her unwavering pursuit of a fairer world.